Welcome to the International Shakespeare Authorship Symposium. My name is Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. I'm the founder of Controversy Films and a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. I'm very excited to be co-hosting this event. We have almost over 300 people joining us from around the world. We're live streaming today from the studios of AV Presentations just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and we want to thank our tech team, Dave Santos and Morris Beverly, for their assistance. Our theme for the symposium today is the Shakespeare attribution: information, misinformation, and changing opinions. To tell you more about our speakers and today's program, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Earl Showerman.
Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Earl
And
Showerman,
welcome.
MD, graduated from Harvard College and the University of Michigan Medical School and practiced emergency medicine in Oregon for over 30 years. A longtime patron of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, after retiring from medicine in 2003, Earl enrolled at Southern Oregon University to study Shakespeare and pursue his decades-long love affair with the authorship question. In recent years, Earl has presented a series of papers at authorship conferences on the topic of Shakespeare's Greater Greek, and he wrote the chapter on Shakespeare's medical knowledge in the book Shakespeare Beyond Doubt? Earl serves as the SOF board secretary and chairs the conference committee, and he is an associate of the Shakespearean Authorship Trust of the UK.
Well,
Welcome, Earl.
thank you so much, Cheryl. And I represent the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship today, which is a 501c3 educational organization carrying on the century of scholarship challenging the traditional attribution of the Shakespeare canon and promoting research and sharing ideas supporting the claim of Edward de Vere's 17th Earl of Oxford as a true author. April 12th is Edward de Vere's birthday. So this month we are actually celebrating his birth with the symposium. The Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship provides many services to support this mission. They publish a quarterly newsletter edited by Alex McNeil. For the past 23 years, it has also published the Oxfordian, a peer-reviewed journal, currently edited by Gary Goldstein. It also is providing a Brief Chronicles book series edited by Roger Strittmatter, and several titles have already been published, and we'll be talking about them later today. It sponsors Don't Quill the Messenger, our podcast series hosted by Stephen Sable, now in its third year, posting interviews every 2 weeks online. It has an annual membership meeting, and customarily until the COVID era, a 4-day conference. We had to cancel our conference in 2020 and again in 2021 in Ashland, but we'll be back in 2022 with more words on that in the future. We also have sponsored virtual as well as in-person symposia and summer seminars in the past. We have a speakers bureau. Research grants are provided by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Over $50,000 have been distributed in recent years for research done in the archives in England, France, and Italy, with some remarkable findings. We have a speakers bureau, but most importantly, and really the means by which we reach our interested parties is our website with editors Brian Wildenthal and Jennifer Newton, who provide a platform for investigation of the Shakespeare authorship question, including news items, articles, and archives of publications that go back many, many years. I would encourage you all to certainly explore the website. Because of this being Oxford's birthday month and the symposium, we are also sponsoring a fundraiser throughout the month of April celebrating those people who are capable of adding a little extra to the coffers to help us maintain this mission. And thanks primarily to the generosity of Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship trustee Ben August, many gifts are available, including a beautiful composite marble bust of the Earl of Oxford, a canvas painting depicting Oxford, the man behind the mask of Shakespeare, which is a reproduction of the 1575 Welbeck portrait, a fine a lithograph print linking Oxford and Shakespeare to the authorship question, and a series of combinations of bottles of Earl 17 from Ben August that I think is very quaffable, really. Highly recommend Earl 17 Wines. And finally, lifetime membership in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is also available. Go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website and click on the fundraiser link, and you'll find your way to those gifts with greater descriptions of what's available. These sessions will be recorded today, and most of the presentations will be made available in the weeks ahead on our YouTube channel. Cheryl and I will be handling questions and answers. The chat is turned off. If we don't have time to answer your questions during the time that we have limited here, we will forward your questions to the presenter so that the appropriate responses can be generated and your questions answered. Kevin Gilvary and Roger Strittmatter have also submitted syllabus materials that are available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Symposium webpage. So I recommend you go there and click on. There's several links there that are valuable, that give you PDFs of good information and challenging exercises. Michael Dudley, one of our speakers today, is quoted as saying recently that the Shakespeare authorship question, the proposition that these plays and poems have for centuries been attributed to the wrong person, is treated with unique disapprobation in the Academy and almost universally excluded from scholarly curricula in inquiry. Today, you are really going to hear from an all-star cast of international scholar writers who will challenge that position. So I want to take this time now to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Kevin Gilvary is honorary president of the De Vere Society, as well as a trustee of the Shakespearean Authorship Trust of the UK, and 2011 Oxfordian of the Year. Dr. Gilvary is a major contributor and overall editor of Dating Shakespeare's Plays, published originally in 2010, now available freely online and recently issued by Portia Press. So I really recommend this book. It's a terrific resource. And more recently, he did study classics at the University of Southampton. He travels with little small editions of Plato when he does his world travels. He's taught English at the college level for over 30 years. His doctoral thesis was awarded by Brunel University and has been published by Routledge as The Fictional Lives of Shakespeare, How Modern Biographers Rely on Context, Conjecture, and Inference to Construct the Life of the Bard. Dr. Gilvary lives in the charming village of Titchfield in Hampshire, home of the erstwhile Earls of Southampton. Take it away, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much, Earl, and good afternoon to everyone from a fairly cold England. We're still locked down, so we can't really go out and share a drink at the moment, but I would like to join this symposium in the proper way by toasting all of you. And I'll be drinking more of that later. I really enjoyed last autumn's event, so that was broadcast from Ben August's vineyard, and it reminded me of when he invited us all a few years ago after or prior to another conference at Oakland, and we went there and we watched Tom Regnier perform, and that was very, very funny and in retrospect very, very moving. After the conference, Earl kindly invited me back to Ashland, Oregon, where we unexpectedly had breakfast with Alan Nelson. I eagerly asked him if he would like to read and even review my book, The Fictional Lives of Shakespeare, and he agreed. I was very surprised, and he's very pleasant about it. Now, in this book, I attempted to show all the layers of speculation, misinterpretation, fantasies in the biographies of Shakespeare, and only relying on mainstream sources. I want to show that in their own terms, they were extremely inconsistent and very, very speculative. Now, it did get reviewed in a mainstream journal. The Reverend Dr. Paul Edmondson of Stratford Birthplace Trust began his review by saying, Kevin Gilvary clearly has a problem with the art of Shakespearean biography. Clearly has a problem. It sounds like a toothache, doesn't it? It sounds very personal to me, not anything outside as me. And then I was struck by this phrase, the art of Shakespearean biography. Where does that come from? Why is writing about Shakespeare's life an art? I mean, what about writing about Charles Dickens or Henry James? Is that an art? So I was really, really struck by that as being sort of a bit of a surprise. Surely, I thought to myself, all biographies should employ the same kind of rigorous evaluation of primary sources as writing the life of Philip Sidney or Ben Jonson. And in my original conclusion, I said they didn't, that Shakespearean biography was sui generis, of its own kind, unique. Now, I'm going to try and show, there we go, a slideshow, Fictional Lives. I began this many, many years ago before I'd ever really thought about the authorship. And in particular, I was struck by the fact that someone from a modest provincial background should present so many plays involving kings and emperors, princes and princesses, dukes and earls, and all of them intriguing, quarrelling, rebelling over inheritance, succession rights, palatial infighting. But to me, this seemed very unlikely material to dominate the output of a man from Stratford, a modest background in the provinces, and also very unlikely for staging to the general public in the globe. So I began to read about the life of Shakespeare. That was back in the late 90s. Stanley Wells, Dennis Kay, Park Honan, Anthony Holden. I was struck by the inconsistencies. They simply asserted their own views without any recourse to what other people were saying. It seemed extremely odd. Moreover, their studies were littered with one hedge after another. Perhaps this was, maybe he did this. It's most likely he did something else. Probably he did, and surely he did. One of my favourites is the word doubtless, especially when it precedes a statement. What does it really mean? It means I have no doubt that, which in fact means there is no evidence that. Doubtless young William attended Stratford Grammar School really means there is no evidence that he did. Another favourite of mine was the word evidently. Evidently, he enjoyed the patronage of the Earl of Southampton, meaning there is no evidence that he enjoyed the patronage of the Earl of Southampton. So when I was reading these early biographies, I started making notes under different headings about their contradictory claims. Now, the problem was that soon afterwards, there was an avalanche of biographies of the bard. They started coming thick and fast in the new millennium, and my notes expanded exponentially. Each author claimed infallibly to have identified the Dark Lady or the Fair Youth through sheer brilliance of their own detective work. And they considered his religious affiliations. For some, he was a devout Catholic. For others, he was a confirmed Protestant, even a Puritan. And as for the lost years of early manhood, well, he spent them in a law office, or somebody else, in the service of the Lord. No, he was in an army abroad, or he was a sailor on the high seas. Now, they can't all be right. Some say he joined the Queen's men, or was it the Stranger's men, or was it Pembroke's men? And that was by no means the end of it, because in the next 10 years or so, another tsunami of studies came along. None of these are really any better than the rest. In fact, some of them are a good deal worse. Now, fortunately, the flood seems to have dried out. Presumably, publishers believe that the market is saturated with the biographies of the bard. So when the Reverend Doctor of Stratford says, I have a problem, he's right. I have a big problem. Well, two, actually. The first one, the dearth of evidence, and the second one, the multiplicity of speculation. Now, let's begin with the unfounded assertion that we know more about Shakespeare than about any other writer of the early modern period. Wrong. Completely false. We know far more about the life of Sir Philip Sidney, and he was a pretty good poet and storyteller. And as for Ben Jonson, we know a huge amount, most of which he tells us himself in his own personal writings. As for William of Stratford, no biography, in the typical sense of the word, is possible due to the poverty of the data. Just a few records to allow us a glimpse of his life story, interspersed by fragments of knowledge. Indeed, there are only gaps in our ignorance. Now, when I began to take an interest in Shakespeare, I found it very frustrating to read one biography after another, but find few transcripts of relevant records. I kept asking myself, where's your evidence? And initially, I was like pleasant. Oh, Stanley, where's your evidence? And then I became a bit more angry, like this judge here. Where's your evidence? Why is one view of Shakespeare's tearful attendance at his son's funeral completely different from the description of his son's austere Puritan interment? Are these claims based on primary sources? In fact, there's no record of any type or any style of any funeral in Stratford at the time. We don't know whether William even attended his son's funeral, or indeed if he was tearful. Maybe William was secretly relieved. Perhaps the boy was sickly who went to a better place. Perhaps he bore an uncanny resemblance to an apprentice in his father's workshop. So these descriptions of his attendance at the funeral might be artistic, but they're not history, they're fiction. Now, I have a quaint old idea that we should base our studies on contemporary documents or primary sources. So primary source is a document, an image, and an artifact that provides evidence about the past. It's original, created contemporaneously, and it directly and unambiguously references the subject. So if you say, oh, a soccer team, a football team like Chelsea won the European Cup and their captain was John Terry, therefore John Terry lifted the cup, you would not be doing something which unambiguously references that person, because, as everybody knows, he was suspended for the final. So when you say the Lord Chamberlain did something, do we assume that Shakespeare had to be part of it? Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but it's not unambiguous. Right, looking at the records, there are some records, about 80 handwritten records, and they're mainly official ones. It gets a mention on title pages. Well, I'm not sure about that, because the spelling is actually noticeably different. And there are about 18 allusions in print in his lifetime. And that, to me, is not very much. One set of allusions, the legal papers of the Belloc Mountjoy case in 1612. There are 18 references to William of Stratford, and which he indicates his name, where he comes from. He's from Stratford. How old is he? He's about 48. And he knew the family, and he once lodged there around about 8 years previously, 1604. But apart from that, he doesn't tell us anything. It sounds a bit like Manuel in Fawlty Towers when they say to him, well, can you tell us about Stephen Belloc's arrangement with it? I know nothing. And what about the diary? I know nothing. And what about Mountjoy? I know nothing. I mean, if those are the handwritten records, we're not actually learning very much. Now, one thing that I'm really, really looking forward to, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic, is Alexander Wall and Roger Stripmatt have been working on a new Shakespeare allusion book. Actually, it's 2 volumes, and this will be invaluable for anyone interested in the life of Shakespeare, the works, and the allusions. Let's have another look a bit more closely at what types of biographical data that we've got. Right, so the personal documents, apart from the will, do not exist, and this is the most important thing for any biography. If you want to know about Ben Jonson, what's he say about himself? If you want to know about Charles Dickens, what's he say about himself? Accounts of witnesses, well, not really very much. We've got this story from Manningham about going to visit a lady and getting there for Burbage, but apart from that, we don't really have very much. Somebody says that they asked him about the enclosures, but this is not really even telling us what he looked like, how big he was, what kind of person he was, or anything. And then the official documents really tell us a vague framework, but we're still just gaps in our ignorance. Now, one document, just to show how it could be overinterpreted, according to the Art of Shakespearean biography, is this interpretation on the left. Thomas Platter went to the newly opened Globe Theatre, fair enough, newly opened, to see a play. As it happened, he saw an early performance of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Does he say he saw Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? Well, if you read what it says on the right, no, he doesn't. Is it an early performance? No, it isn't. So is it the Globe Theatre? Well, we're not sure. Now, if these are 50-50 statements, then you start multiplying the odds there, and we're down to about 1 in 6 chance that this is, or 1 in 8 chance, can't remember now, that all this statement, a very straightforward one, is actually valid. So this is an indication of where we got overinterpretation, or as I would like to say, fictionalization. Now, I was very, very pleased. I got hold of this giant book by Samuel Schoenbaum, William Shakespeare, A Documentary Life. Here we go. Documents at last. Let's go and have a look at these. But I was really a bit disappointed. The number of documents which actually named William Stratford in his lifetime, about a quarter of them, just over 50 out of 217. Quite a few of them are contextual, fair enough, but most of them, by far the biggest of them, are posthumous. And to be honest, this is not a documentary life. What he does is he tells a narrative, and then he fits the documents in along the way, making it seem as if everything in there is documented, whereas in fact it's not the case. And just to show it, I look at the records for William in his childhood and youth. About a quarter to a third of all biographies talk about William's childhood and his youth in Stratford, how he lived at home with his family, all these other people who were around the place, how he went to school there, and that sort of thing. And we don't have any records. From his birth at the top left, 1564, the next record is 1582, when there's a license issued for his marriage. We don't even know if he's there because it's issued to other people. 1583, we've got the birth of his daughter. 1585, the birth of his twins. And that's it. No records for his childhood and youth. So everything they say about childhood and youth is fictional. Oh no, we've got a pretty good idea of what a typical life in Stratford was like. Well, actually, no, we haven't, because nobody else wrote what was the typical life. And even if we did have a view of what a typical childhood in Stratford was like at the time, we don't know if William Stratford had a typical one or whether he had an atypical one. And I would say it had to be atypical. If this is orange juice. If there's anybody who had an atypical childhood, it had to be the author of the plays. Right, so that's a period of lost years, which nobody ever seems to notice. They just sort of gloss over. They talk glibly about it, but we don't know. And this actually began in the Victorian period. In the 1840s, Thomas Carlyle said, we need to have a life of Shakespeare. And this was it. And it was a Victorian life, a great, wonderful life of a gentle man in a gentle family, growing up, fulfilling his greatness, his destiny. And look at this lovely picture in here. We've got father there, son on his knee, and he's reading from Holland's Head. Must be the 1877 version, because young William there is only about 10. Looks like the dog's about to eat him, actually. Now, did John actually know how to read? Well, there's no evidence that he ever signed his name or anything like that, so I'm not sure he did, or that he could ever read Holland's Head to young William at a young age like that. And anyway, it's just fictional. It's just invention. And he was the first person, closely followed by the following year, John Payne Collier, and still in the 1840s by James Orchard Halliwell. And the three of them produce a Victorian life of Shakespeare, something in which he's really good, really nice, lovely lad, but fictional. So after 1585, we've got a middle period of lost years. This is the period which is acknowledged as lost. And I think it's 10 years from when his twins are born. Now, we don't even know if he was actually present when they were born, to 1595, when he's recorded as receiving money on behalf of the Lord Chamberlain's men. That's a period of about 10 years, aged between 21 and 31, slap in the middle of his life. Nobody notices him, except maybe Robert Greene in Groatsworth, but that's a bit doubtful. It's not an unambiguous reference. Other people think it says it. And anyway, it just says he's a plagiarist. So not really saying very much. So this is the second period of lost years. And then we've got the third period of lost years in London. If you look at the red ones, we go 1604, attendance at the Hampton Court Conference as some kind of attendant. There's a minion there because there are loads and loads of people in attendance. And then not mentioned again until 1612 properly, when he's called up to say, I know nothing. Now, this is when he's at the height of his powers, when all his plays have been performed at court, and James and others, they say fantastic. And we've got a third period. So nobody seems to mention this. They just, right. I love it that somebody could write a book about 1606 and they say what Shakespeare was doing that year when there isn't a single reference to him in that year. I think that is fiction at its very best. Now, Alan Nelson came back to me, and this is what he said. Now, the first half of it really sort of sums up what Reverend Paul Edmondson was saying, that I've got a problem with the biography of Shakespeare because the documentary evidence doesn't survive in sufficient quantity. And then the second one, the art of Shakespeare biography, is, well, outright fiction or description in historical context. So now that's the end of my slides.
And if you could turn on your video, Kevin, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm going to try and start my video. Here we go. And am I back on?
Yes,
you
you
see
are.
Me?
Yes, bravo.
Right then.
Nicely done.
Hello there, everyone. Phew. Oh dear, gosh, all this new technology gets. Now I've got my laptop here and I've got my notes here. So if I'm looking over there, it's not because I have a squint or avoiding people. It's because I'm over there. Talking about Alan Nelson, he wrote a very detailed, very thorough biography of Edward de Vere. And he didn't have a problem with lack of evidence, did he? Because about 80 of Oxford's letters in his own hand, autographed letters, survive. Lots and lots of documentation. We can place him at a single point on many, many occasions in his life. We can only do that once with William of Stratford, and that's when he's called to the hall at Westminster to talk about Belloc Mountjoy and say, I know nothing. So the problem, of course, with Nelson's biography is that he's rarely misses an opportunity to decry, deplore, denounce, disparage, denigrate, or deprecate his subject. Now, in common with many others, I felt this was due to his distaste at the thought that Oxford might possibly be considered a claimant to the Shakespeare canon. But it puzzled me for a while that Oxford also has a bad reputation with mainstream historians. Consider this by a reputable American biographer in 1960 about the letter Oxford sent to Burghley concerning Anne Cecil. Oxford was a cad. Now, I thought that was a British word, isn't it? That was an American word. Oxford was a cad, if ever there was one. He would not charge his wife with anything, but he was well rid of her. It's rather shocking to discover that a young, unwhipped cub like Oxford could have dared to write in these terms to the chief minister of the Queen. Whew. Oh my goodness, an unwhipped cub. Now that was Conyers Reed in, I think, Mr. Secretary Burghley. Now, I thought that the anti-Oxfordian sentiment was a reaction to J. Thomas Loney's case in Shakespeare Identified. But Oxford's unsavoury reputation for infamy and dishonour had actually been established before that. Such sentiments had been expressed by Martin Hume in 1898. The title of his book, The Great Lord Burghley, A Study in Elizabethan Statecraft, indicates where his sympathies lie. Sidney Lee, in his entry on Oxford in the DNB in 1899, continued the attack on Oxford, referring to his violent and perverse temper, his eccentric taste in dress, oh shock, and his reckless waste of his substance. So he's seen as a baddie, and during the Victorian period, biographies said people were goodies or they were baddies. People did nice things or they did bad things. And if you've got a goodie like Burghley, who sees through many threats in crisis, which I think probably he did, then if he's unhappy with somebody, he's clearly a baddie. But they don't seem to take it any further than that. And I thought it might be worth looking to see where these originated. Well, in the latter part of the Victorian period, there are two multi-volume digests which are very, very important. One is the Calendar of State Papers Domestic. They were completed by 1870 for the period covering Elizabeth's reign. And then another digest was the Calendar of Cecil Papers in Hatfield House. The volumes covering the period until Burghley's death, 1898, had appeared by that time. 1598, appeared by 1898. Now, the Cecil Papers were initiated and maintained with astonishing efficiency by William Cecil. He gave orders for all his state correspondence to be copied. He maintained his own private journals. No mention of Shakespeare. Cecil's papers devolved on his youngest son, Robert, later Earl of Salisbury, and their descendants have been active in politics. And the records are still maintained carefully to this day at Hatfield. Now, Victorians, of course, maintained the greatest respect for Burghley's achievements in steering the Elizabethan government through all these crises and threats. And Hatfield House itself passed down the line from Robert Cecil to the present Lord Salisbury, a government minister. Perhaps the most important lineal descendant was at the time of Victoria, Lord Salisbury, 3 times Prime Minister. So Victorian commentators were very keen to take his side and to see anybody who was bad or disparaged by Burghley as being bad. He was intractable. He was clearly a bad husband, he was a violent temper, and he sent his patrimony flying. Now, I don't know that he was a bad husband. I don't think he pushed his wife down the stairs, as the Earl of Leicester was said to have done, or that some of the others. And if Oxford had not married Anne Cecil, he wouldn't really get a mention in Burghley's diaries there. It would be somebody else. It would have been Sidney. He'd have been the baddie there. Secondly, he was of a violent temper. Well, you know, compare it to Essex and the rising there and quite a few other people. A fair few of his contemporaries were sent to the block. You know, the Duke of Norfolk, you've got Essex, you've got the Earl of Northumberland. I can't remember how many there are, lots of them. Other people like Charles Arundel, who accused him of being a monstrous adversary, was a Catholic traitor who escaped to the continent where he schemed to bring down Elizabeth. Now, as for sending his patrimony flying, well, actually, when Oxford's father died and he was still only 12 years old, he was taken in as a ward. and he never really regained control of his estates. We've seen that. Nina Green's done a great job. Mark Anderson refers to it, and especially Daphne Pearson as well. Burghley was a corrupted, avaricious master of the court of wards and liveries, and he used every opportunity to take his money away from him. And it's no coincidence that while Oxford lost all his estates, Burghley gained and then started building some fantastic houses. He was about the only minister of Elizabeth who actually died in credit. Now look what he built. The magnificent Burghley House, fantastic place. The magnificent Cecil House on the Strand. Tybalt's house, where he entertained the Queen on numerous occasions, and King James coveted it and swapped it for Hatfield. And then what's not known so much, Wimbledon Palace. He built a great big Italian-style villa there. So while Oxford's estate and his means are being diminished, then we've got Burghley's increasing. And anybody who says that Oxford's a bad person, relying solely on Burghley, ought to take that into account. Now, my final point, I'm coming up to the time, is about the authorship question. I think we must be ready to concede that the case for Oxford as Shakespeare is circumstantial. It's a very strong case, and to me, it's overwhelming and convincing, but it is still circumstantial. So we must continue to look for direct contemporary evidence which states that Oxford wrote the plays. And for this reason, I'm very, very glad that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has been awarding research grants. Michael Delahoyd and Colin Moriarty has been in Italy. They've discovered exciting new material in Venice and elsewhere. Eddie Jolly in England has been investigating archives. And finally, I believe that Cheryl herself, Eagan-Donovan, and Roger Stripmatter, they will be conducting further investigations. And I wish them great success. After all, we don't want any more fictional lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I would like to add that Alexander Waugh texted us just a minute ago that he says he has heard from Lord Cranbourne, Lord Salisbury's son, that they have more papers that have never been released at Hatfield concerning Oxford. Believe me, I am working on it.
Well, that's great news. Absolutely great. Perhaps we should get an independent researcher to verify them, because one of the things that there was complained about, I mean, Alan Nelson noticed this, was that I didn't use any non-standard authorities. I didn't want anyone to say, you've quoted Earl Showerman, and we all know that he's a Philistine, and so on. I wanted it to be there. So perhaps if we say, oh, look at this, we found this document, then it'll be open to question. But that sounds great. That's absolute news to me. So wonderful. Thank you.
Hot off the press. How great is that, Kevin? Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Kevin. And at this point, I would like to introduce our next presenter during our symposium today. So if you would turn off your, thank you, Kevin. James Warren is our next speaker. He's a retired diplomat and 2020 Oxfordian of the Year. Jim edited the centenary edition of J. Thomas Loney's Shakespeare Identified, and subsequently published Shakespeare Revealed, bringing to light 43 lost articles and letters published subsequent to the publication of Shakespeare Identified. He is the editor of the Index of Oxfordian Publications, a massive tome that he has been publishing now in its 4th edition, which is a great resource that I use all the time. So he is also the author of the novel Summer Storm, which is a story of a professor and the students wrestling with how we know what we know, among other things, the authorship of Shakespeare's works. Jim is presenting on the Oxfordian Movement and Academia. Take it away, Jim.
Well, greetings, everyone. At the online symposium last October, I identified 3 levels of resistance to the Oxfordian claim, 3 factors that made it difficult for many people to accept Edward de Vere as the mind and personality behind the pen name William Shakespeare. The first type is human resistance, the normal resistance that most people feel when their long-held beliefs are challenged. The second, cognitive resistance, is the resistance the mind feels when confronted by a claim as complex as the Oxfordian claim. And third is institutional resistance from academia, That's what I want to talk more about today. Now, over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time studying the history of the Oxfordian idea introduced by John Thomas Looney 101 years ago. I put my findings and my thoughts about them into a book that will come out probably in the next month or two, hopefully by the end of May. Whoops. Okay, it's titled Shakespeare Revolutionized, the First 100 Years of John Thomas Looney's Shakespeare Identified. It's just what the subtitle implies. It tells the story of how Looney's book has influenced thinking about Shakespeare over the past century. It tells three stories. Those of how the Oxfordian idea has influenced public opinion, how it has given rise to an Oxfordian movement, and how it has engendered resistance within academia. Now, it took me 800 pages to tell those stories. Here's a proof of the book, which is also proof that the book actually exists. You can see how thick it is. It maybe for some people looks like a phone book. I tried as hard as I could to make it as thin as possible, but it did take 800 pages. But the pages aren't solid text. There are images and text boxes to break up the text a bit. On this page is an image of Cecil Palmer's advertisement for Shakespeare identified from the Times Literary Supplement on the day the book was published. And on this page is a text box. I provided text boxes for 22 of the most important Oxfordian scholars in the first quarter century of the Oxfordian movement. Shown here is Colonel Bernard Ward, who founded the Shakespeare Fellowship in 1922. Now, one thing I found during my research was that during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement, from 1920 through the mid-1940s, was that Oxfordians had made considerable progress in overcoming human resistance and cognitive resistance, but little progress in overcoming institutional resistance. And it's pretty much the same story today. During the second wave of the Oxfordian movement that began with the publication of Charlton Ogburn's The Mysterious William Shakespeare at the end of 1984. The reason that progress has been made in overcoming the first two types of resistance, but not the third, is, I believe, that institutional resistance is distinctly different from the first two types. Institutional resistance is a difference in kind from the first two, just as animals are a difference in kind from plants, even though both are forms of life. The first two types of resistance are similar in that both deal with individuals. Differences between them are matters of degree only. But institutional resistance, which deals with institutions, not individuals, is a difference in kind from the other two. Although we deal with people within academia, those people are not individuals acting as individuals. They're acting as representatives of their institutions, and that makes all the difference. So because there's a difference in kind, a different strategy is needed to deal with institutional resistance. To understand this better, we need to look within academia. Now, for simplicity's sake, during this short talk, I'll divide people within academia into two categories: leaders and everybody else. Leaders of academic departments have two duties: promoting scholarly work within their departments and promoting the interests of their departments themselves. These two duties are distinctly different and sometimes in conflict with each other. When conflicts arise, leaders must seek to identify and further the optimal balance between them, not pursue either to the maximum extent possible. Their goal must be the philosopher's totem bonum, not the summum bonum. Everybody else, like leaders, also has two duties. They have the duty of producing scholarly work and that of remaining in good standing in their institution. Their two duties, like those of the leaders, sometimes conflict with each other, and in such situations, they must do what their leaders do: determine the optimal balance between them. Now, in this very simplified scenario, during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement back in the 1920s and 30s, leaders of departments of literature determined that the Oxfordian challenge to Stratfordian beliefs was not a mere scholarly matter. It was a challenge to the department's prestige and status. As a direct challenge to their good name, it had to be repelled at all costs, regardless of the effect that doing so might have had on the scholarly work carried out within the departments. For everybody else within literature departments, when it came to the Oxfordian claim, 6 factors or types of pressure affected their thinking, and the net effect of them was a strong bias against consideration of it. The first 2 factors, A and B in this equation, are those common to all people, the human and cognitive forms of resistance. The final 4 affect those within academia. Avoidance of disruption to scholarly work is an important factor for professors, for scholars, because it takes a great deal of mental effort to block the rest of the world, to free their mind from other considerations so they can focus on their scholarly work. And for many of them, the authorship question and the Oxfordian challenge was a disruption to their work. Many scholars had vested personal interests in the Stratfordian story because they'd been teaching it and writing about it for so many years. They faced institutional pressure to adhere to the party line from the leaders at the head of their departments and from their peers. And they faced what they recognized as their scholarly duty to pursue the truth of literary matters. So of these 6 factors weighing on professors, 5 push against consideration of the Oxfordian claim. Only 1 supports it. So the result was a bias against examination of the Oxfordian theory. Now, the situation has been expressed in several pithy aphorisms. Here are 2. George Bernard Shaw is reputed to have said that you cannot convert a man whose living depends upon your not converting him. And Upton Sinclair is rumored to have said something similar. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. In sum, then, institutional resistance is a difference in kind from the other 2 types because it comes from institutions, not individuals. It's actively hostile to the Oxfordian claim, it's well organized, and it's well funded with a range of resources and capabilities that can be used to defeat the Oxfordian thesis. And so again, it's a mistake, I believe, to believe that Oxfordians can overcome institutional resistance by following the same strategy that is effective with the other 2 forms of resistance. And yet it is imperative that institutional resistance be overcome, because until it is, all other gains are at risk. The gains Oxfordians have made with public opinion are in danger of being swept away because of pressure flowing outward from academia. The progress made in overcoming human resistance and cognitive resistance is vulnerable to being reversed by academia's hostility to the Oxfordian claim. Many of you may be familiar with the board game Othello, in which 2 opponents attempt to flip each other's pieces so that their color, black or white, dominates the board. In this game, the side that appears to be winning, that has more pieces on the board in its color, can easily find its seeming dominance reversed by a few adroit moves by its opponent. It remains vulnerable until the game is over. As I see it, that's the situation the Oxfordian movement is in until institutional resistance is overcome. Our gains can be reversed. And so it is imperative that Oxfordians figure out what strategy will be effective in engaging academia. Again, it will not be the same strategy that has been effective in overcoming the first 2 types of resistance, because institutions are a difference in kind from individuals. Now, in Shakespeare Revolutionized, I devote 6 chapters to examining academia's response to the Oxfordian challenge. 3 look at its response during the first wave of the Oxfordian movement, and 3 examine its response today. Returning to the 3 stories I mentioned earlier, or maybe I skipped that slide. Anyways, the effect that Shakespeare identified has had on public opinion and on the development of an Oxfordian movement over the past century can be easily seen. When an American sitcom has a character who is an Oxfordian played by Christopher Lloyd, That demonstrates very clearly that the idea of Edward de Vere as Shakespeare has reached a certain depth of penetration into public consciousness. When Mark Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name is on the shelves at Barnes & Noble, that says something similar. Oops. There we go. With academia, though, the influence is there, but it's beneath the surface. The Oxfordian claim has influenced or affected academia much more deeply than most Shakespeare scholars will admit. It has become the black hole around which traditional scholars conduct their work as they desperately seek ways to avoid having to examine the authorship issue in the same objective manner that they study all other literary matters. Now, I've spent 6 years investigating the first 100 years of the Oxfordian movement, in part because I enjoyed it. And I've written this book because I enjoyed doing that too. But that's not the full story. I've invested so much time and effort in these activities, not merely to write an historical study, as important as that may be, but to try to determine what strategy would put the Oxfordian idea over the top. When I began, I hoped to learn what strategies for promoting the Oxfordian thesis over the past century had and hadn't worked, so that I could design a strategy that would be effective in convincing universities, colleges, and schools to teach that William Shakespeare was a pen name used by Edward de Vere, just as they teach that Mark Twain is a pen name used by Samuel Longhorn Clemens. So after 24 chapters of building up to it, Shakespeare Revolutionized concludes with a chapter explaining my ideas on how the Oxfordian Revolution might finally be completed. The strategy itself is too big a subject to go into here, where the limited amount of time available has restricted me to a mere introduction to the subject of how best to engage academia. But one important aspect of the solution involves seeking out allies and motivating them to engage departments of literature on the authorship question. I'll give you two quick examples. Historians, departments of history, and professional bodies of historians might be incensed to learn how severely the history of the Elizabethan era has been corrupted by bad ideas flowing out of Shakespeare studies. And they could perhaps be encouraged to express their disappointment directly to Shakespeare scholars. Legal organizations might be angered to learn that Shakespeare's extensive legal knowledge is dismissed by many Shakespeare scholars, and the valid concept of circumstantial evidence is disparaged within Shakespeare studies. They too can be encouraged to express their dismay directly to Shakespeare studies sections. And with that, I'll stop here and be happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, I'm relating what Rick Wagerman's asked. Jim, one thing we can do is join mainstream organizations such as the Shakespeare Association of America and the more open-minded Renaissance Society of America. Both organizations are international in scope.
That's a great idea, because the more forums that we can present the Oxfordian idea to, the better, the closer we'll get to the paradigm shift that we all want to see.
Shelley Maycock has asked a question. What do you think about the idea that the money-making Shakespeare industry, for example, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and other academic wings, Oxford and their institute, as well as the Folger Shakespeare Library, and much more, in cahoots with the NEH, which dole out how much needed research and promotional money also determine the actions of academia?
Well, money is certainly of overwhelming importance. I know several professors who spend much of their time pursuing grants, filling out grant forms, and trying to get the funding they need for their research. And so, the NEH and the other big foundations, the Ford Foundation and so on, seem to listen to Stratfordians when making decisions about what academic projects are worth funding. And since they all seem to have the same opinion and all go to the same scholars within academia for advice on what projects to fund, I don't have, well, I guess what that emphasizes is the need to overcome the resistance within academia, because so many others apply, they turn to academia for its opinion on what projects or what subjects are worth funding. You know, the NEH does that, the media does that, the public turns to academia. So that just reinforces the point I made earlier, that we must overcome the academic resistance to the Oxfordian claim. We cannot work only with individuals outside of academia. We have to conquer the institutional resistance.
Joella Werland asked, what about focusing on the Folger? And I think particularly in the idea of the 400th anniversary of the publication of the first folio.
Well, that's for us a very, very important anniversary. In my book, in one of the chapters, I talk about Roger's phenomenal special issue of Brief Chronicles that focused on the first folio tour in 2016. I'm really hoping that he does something similar related to the anniversary coming up 2 years from now, because it's a great opportunity for us to get our message out, because the media is always looking for a hook, for something that's new, for some angle it can use to before it will address a subject. And so that anniversary gives us the hook that we need. If we can somehow play on that, it's an opportunity for us to get our message about the Oxfordian authorship out into the media.
Diane Elliott recently asked a question of engaging high school teachers, as was done recently at their NCTE conference in Baltimore last year or 2 years ago, helps create the students who will ask questions in their university Shakespeare classes. Any history of this type of action going on?
I don't know. I haven't been involved firsthand in those activities, but I heard reports from that conference of high school teachers that were very positive. Teachers, from the reports I heard, had far more interest in the subject and said that their students were far more interested in it than reports I've heard about university professors. James Shapiro even said that if any student brings up the authorship question in his classes, he'll flunk the student. But I think that sort of attitude is far rarer among high school students. So they're a definite way that if we can reach them by attending future conferences of high school students, provide information to them, teaching curriculum, syllabi, and so on that they can use. I think that's a great way to proceed, and we should do that to the fullest extent that it's open to us.
Alexander Waugh has added a comment. Academia is a general term. Should we not be splitting history from English lit? Historians are far less biased.
Historians, I think, are far less biased, but Shakespeare studies has such cachet and such status that no one wants to be seen as being out of line with Shakespeare studies. So that's one of the problems that I outline in one of the chapters of the book. That even historians, when it comes to the Elizabethan era and anything relating to Shakespeare, if they hear ideas that contradict what the usual story, they often go to Shakespeare scholars in their universities to check with them on how valid these ideas are. And of course, if they're Oxfordian ideas, they get the thumbs down from the university professors. So we need to encourage historians to be even more independent, especially when it comes to Shakespeare, than I think they've been in the past.
Connor Cutting mentions a good point. What do you think about the efforts of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition's Declaration of Reasonable Doubt? The signatory count is closing in on 5,000 notable signatories and are nearing a notable 100 and almost 1,000 academic signatures. So a total of 5,000 notable signatories nearing 100 and almost 1,000 academic signatures.
Yeah, well, the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt was a brilliant idea. And I know John Shahan and the SAC have worked very hard to implement it and promote it and publicize it and get signatures, because it's a great way of separating the authorship question or doubts about Shakespeare from the Oxfordian question. You know, it simplifies the issue. If we can focus only on doubts about Shakespeare and not worry about alternate candidates who would replace him as author. In a sense, it simplifies things by separating the two issues. I've talked about this in one of the chapters of my book too. I think it's fair to say that the Declaration, although it's a brilliant idea, it hasn't quite caught on. The media hasn't quite picked it up and publicized it the way that the SAC and John Shahan had hoped. But that's no reason not to continue with that effort. It's a brilliant idea, and it could be that maybe its time hasn't come yet, but its time will come, and we need to keep it out there in the public idea or public eye as much as possible, because the greater the doubts grow, the more, it's like a rock going downhill, snowball rolling downhill. It starts slowly, but it gets faster and faster as it goes down. And that could be what will happen with the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. It could catch on, and there may be 5,000 signatures now. There could be 50,000 a year or two from now, or at the time of the anniversary of the first folio in 2 years. And who knows? In 10 years, it could be 1 million. As I said, it's a great idea, and they need to keep pushing that and publicizing it to the greatest extent possible.
Brian Woodland asked the question, when Darwin published his theory of evolution, how did it become accepted despite institutional, scientific, and religious resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I addressed that subject also in one of the chapters. But I note that two things. One is that the idea had a strong and aggressive promoter of the idea, other than Darwin himself. Thomas Huxley, T.H. Huxley, was known as Darwin's bulldog for the aggressive way he promoted the idea. And that made a big difference. The Oxfordian idea also had a bulldog, and I talk about this in one of the books. Percy Allen could have been described as Darwin's bulldog for the aggressive way that he promoted the Oxfordian idea in books and articles and letters to editors and public talks that he gave. He gave more public talks on the Oxfordian idea than anyone else in the first quarter century of the Oxfordian movement. The other idea, thing I want to say about Darwin's theory is that it was of interest to biologists, but it didn't quite convince the majority of biologists, I think, until population genetics explained, which came along 50 years later, explained how traits were passed on. Mendel's pea plants and so on led into population genetics, which explained how genes code for, before they knew about genes and chromosomes and so on, it was very hard to convince people that Darwin's theory was right because he couldn't explain how it worked. So there was two phases in the process of acceptance of that idea. And it could be that the Oxfordian idea hasn't quite had its second phase yet. We're still stuck on the first phase, and that might be what's holding back full acceptance of it.
Two academics have posted questions that will conclude our commentaries today. Don Rubin is saying that he somewhat disagrees with the party line that being pushed by universities, hiring committees simply hire people who agree with them and rarely risk unless they are given a specific mandate, such as to create diversity. How can we make Oxfordianism part of the diversity movement? Must we find a way to make it an interesting issue? And Andrew Salzman, so Don's raising the question of diversity. Andrew Salzman writes, Speaking as an academic of 40 years, the only way to change academia, which is a bastion motivated by nearly always by greed and prestige, is to enlist a champion that is within their lair, who is so prestigious that their word threatens the others with their prestige. You need to find one key opinion leader who is so prestigious he or she can speak to the truth without fear of retribution. So Don saying diversity, Andrew saying find a spear-shaking, prestigious colleague. Well, in England, of course, Sir Derek Jacobi and Sir Mark Rylance have been prestigious advocates of our cause in Great Britain. But anyway, any further ideas or responses to Don's and Andrew's issues they've raised?
Yeah, well, I've laid out an in-depth strategy for the core of the strategy is not in persuading professors, it's in forcing them to address the issue by bringing pressure to bear on them from many sources, from many allies. The diversity issue, intellectual diversity does not seem to be the sort of diversity that's promoted within universities. So I don't quite see how that would work. On the idea of someone like James Shapiro or Jonathan Bate or some known academic inside the university walls, if someone of that stature came out in favor of an objective consideration of the authorship question within academia, or even support for the Oxfordian idea, then there'd be no need for my strategy. We can throw out chapter 25 of my book because that's what we want to happen as a result of my strategy, is that someone, some very senior respected academic comes out publicly in support of the Oxfordian claim. So that's really what needs to happen. There needs to be basically a civil war take place within academia, within Shakespeare studies. And my strategy is designed to sort of be the atom bomb that will launch the nuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb within academia.
Thank you so much, Jim. You let the revolution begin. So stay tuned, everybody. Jim will be speaking to us again near the conclusion a little bit more about his forthcoming publication project. So it's my pleasure now to introduce a new speaker at one of our forums. Michael Dudley has a Master in Library Information Science and a Master's in City Planning, which will position him uniquely once the attribution is switched to Oxford, because Castle Hedingham and its little village will need some help from people like Michael to deal with the onrush of interest there. He is the Community Outreach Librarian at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. He has previously delivered lectures on his research into the lived experience of becoming an Oxfordian, as well as a TED Talk, Liberating Shakespeare. His presentation today is based on his chapter, With Swinish Phrase Soiling Their Edition, Epistemic Injustice, Academic Freedom, and the Shakespeare Authorship Question, published under the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education in Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom, published last year. Michael's topic today is the Stratfordian belief system, epistemic injustice, and academic freedom. Please take it away, Michael.
Thank you very much, Earl, for that introduction. It's great to be able to follow on that presentation, Jim, because I'm hoping that my presentation can contribute to that strategy of overcoming academic resistance. My research agenda in the articles I've published in Brief Chronicles and the Oxfordian aren't really so much about new evidence for Oxford or evidence against Shakespeare, but it's all about applying external, disinterested, theoretical and pedagogical frameworks to Stratfordian scholarship, to just show the extent to which mainstream Shakespeare scholarship does not meet the standards that are otherwise recognized in the academy as what sound scholarship ought to be. So I'm just going to share my slides here. So I'm talking about the Stratfordian belief system. That's my starting point. And so we're not dealing just with an authorial attribution, but this is actually a multi-layered belief system. And the question I'm asking is, how is that belief system defended, and how can we, overcome that resistance, as Jim put it? So I've got two sets of external criteria that I'm using to examine this belief system, and that is virtue epistemology, which I'll be explaining in a minute. And as Earl mentioned, there's the framework for information literacy for higher education, which was officially adopted by the Association of College and Research Libraries in 2016. So this is a pedagogical tool that we academic librarians use to teach library instruction to undergraduate students, and to try to inculcate in them what, a disposition towards sound scholarship. I'm going to be looking at key Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices through this framework and through this lens of virtue epistemology. As Earl mentioned, this was a chapter published in a book this past November, Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom, edited by Anakshi Sengupta and Patrick Blessinger. And I think just in terms of overcoming academic resistance, this is a mainstream academic press, Emerald Publishing. This is part of a long-standing series. This is volume 34 in their series, and they didn't bat an eyelid about publishing a chapter about the authorship question. So, we are making progress in the academy. So what do I mean by Stratfordianism as a belief system? So I say I'm a Stratfordian, and I believe Shakespeare is Shakespeare. That's my propositional belief. William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author, William Shakespeare. And of course, I don't even make a distinction between those spellings. But I also have a second order belief about that belief, that it is a certainty, beyond questioning, beyond doubt. And if you do have any questions, if you are going to challenge me on that belief, I have a host of explanatory beliefs, that Kevin mentioned some of these, the lost years, the miracle of genius, the key documentary evidence is now lost. But these beliefs are faith-based. They are completely unfalsifiable. You cannot disprove any of these. So it's very difficult to challenge. But because I have these beliefs, I also have a reflexive belief about myself as a believer that I cannot be questioned, that I am authoritative in my belief about Shakespeare. I also have an ethical belief that you are not only factually incorrect if you question me, if you question if Shakespeare was Shakespeare, but you are actually immoral. And so I therefore have a juridical or justice-based belief that you need to be punished, that you need to be isolated, excluded, and marginalized within the academy. So what I'm saying is that it's not just this historical fact about the authorship of Shakespeare that we are needing to deal with in terms of human cognitive and institutional resistance, as Jim put it, but it is a belief system, and each one of these elements, is all mutually reinforcing. It's what makes it so difficult for Stratfordians to face the evidence honestly and for them to actually bother reading the work that we produce. So how then to challenge this belief system? I'm using a theory called virtue epistemology. So epistemology is the theory and study of knowledge, how we know what we think we know. And virtue epistemology, says that knowledge just isn't out there. It's actually situated within people, within communities, within groups of people. And so it's looking at, first of all, learning opportunities within our environments, that we have to, that there's an unequal access to knowledge. We can't learn knowledge that may not be available to us. If a virtue epistemologist was to look at the traditional biography of Shakespeare, they would certainly say that that was completely ridiculous. But we're also looking at epistemic character and conduct. Are we open-minded? Are we closed-minded? Do we ignore evidence that's inconvenient to us? Virtue epistemology then is also this ethical framework for looking at our relationships with other knowers and our obligations towards them, to listen to them, to engage in conversation. And so individually and then collectively, as a group, as a community of knowers, we create epistemic systems. Shakespeare biography is an example of an epistemic system. And virtue epistemology can help us understand the nature and resilience of these systems and their ability to allow us to ask new questions, to generate new knowledge. There's a lot to the theories of virtue epistemology. I'm going to focus on three. One is epistemic vice, which is committed by knowers acting in bad faith. So this is poor epistemic conduct, ignoring, disregarding inconvenient evidence, or having poor epistemic character, being dogmatic, being arrogant, refusing to listen to other people. And that is then part of perpetrating testimonial injustice on other people. So you're prejudicially refusing to listen to them based on the class of knowers to which they belong. And then that group of people suffers epistemic oppression, that they are persistently excluded from participating in fields of knowledge production. So I'm sure this is all sounding very familiar to you. There's a particular form of epistemic vice that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians have to contend with, and that is accusations of conspiracy theory, which calls into question the speaker's character, mischaracterizes their claims, compares them invidiously to absurd claims or highly offensive ones. And we're all familiar with the accusations that this is like Holocaust denial. But what it means is that it confines the inquiry to asking why people believe these crazy ideas rather than addressing the substance of their claims. Now, I know at this particular historical and political juncture that there are conspiracy theories that are baseless, that are harmful and toxic to the body politic, but we have to keep in mind that not all conspiracy theories are created equally. And actually, that is something that Stratfordians will say, is that all conspiracy theories are the same, but they're not. To say that they are, to have this blanket accusation of conspiracy theory for ideas you find inconvenient, is a preemption of the investigative process, and it is a mechanism of exclusion. So in this chapter then, the tool that I use, this external framework, to analyze Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices is the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which was adopted in 2016 by the Association of College and Research Libraries. The ACRL is the largest and oldest division of the American Library Association. This is the major academic library association with members in the US and Canada. And this framework is widely adopted. I teach this framework myself as part of library instruction to try to encourage students to think about what sound scholarship consists of. The framework has 6 elements. The first is that authority is constructed and contextual. That what constitutes expertise, conventional wisdom in a discipline may change over time. And the example that I use, and one that we often refer to in the authorship question, is Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, which from when it was introduced in 1915 to most of the first half of the 20th century until it was finally adopted in the mid-1960s, when the mechanism of tectonic plates was able to explain it. But it just shows that mainstream scholarship can exclude ideas that end up becoming the new mainstream. Closely related to this is the idea that information has value, that structures and systems of value in the academy, in the publishing industry, in academic libraries, public libraries, will give precedence to mainstream ideas, mainstream knowledge, and tend to reproduce those mainstream ideas and kind of marginalize new and unknown ideas. And so there's that disparity that that grants precedence to authorities. But as the first frame tells us, these things can change over time. The third frame is research as inquiry. So when we have gaps in our knowledge, it's a cue that we need to be asking different, better, and deeper questions, and not to gloss over these gaps in our knowledge. So this is the core epistemological element of this framework. The fourth is that information creation is a process. This gets at formats for information, and depending on the nature and the purpose, the audience for a piece of knowledge production, it may be a scholarly article, it could be a chapter, it could be a documentary film. I'm looking at you, Cheryl. It could be a podcast, it could be a website. But the point is that we do not make assumptions about the underlying process behind different formats and just dismiss that format because it's not a peer-reviewed scholarly article. Closely related to that is the fifth frame, searching as strategic exploration, that we don't confine ourselves to a small pool of sources or even to the journals within a particular discipline, but we look widely. We look at what other disciplines, what other perspectives they can give on our topic. We maybe look for professional associations, institutions, and find out, what they're producing. We think as widely as we can. And the sixth frame is scholarship as conversation. Peer-reviewed journals, conferences, they're all part of scholarly dialogue, events like this. So ethically, we do not arbitrarily exclude people from that conversation. So we see then these six elements. It's normative, it's aspirational, but it's also ethical. It gets at how we treat other knowers in our own search for knowledge. And I realized several years ago that I could use this framework as a lens for examining Stratfordian scholarship and rhetoric, and to see how well it actually constitutes the standards of this external criteria. So let's see what we can find. The first frame, authority is constructed and contextual. Paul Edmondson writes that the authorship question is, quote, a clash between the professional Shakespeare scholar and the anti-Shakespearean amateur. The former employs often highly specialized knowledge. The latter denies it. There is the loaded assumption that even though one may lack the necessary knowledge and expertise, it is always acceptable to challenge and contradict a knowledgeable and expert authority. It is not. This is just one of many examples that I have in my chapter, that there's this pattern of that Stratfordians are the experts in Shakespeare studies. Anyone who questions Shakespeare's authorship is by definition not a scholar and therefore may be excluded. So completely contradicting the spirit of frame one. Frame two, information has value. Stratfordian books tend to dominate the bestseller lists. Post-Stratfordian, Oxfordian literature is marginalized. And a great example of that is in 2013, Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells produced Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which is now owned in 326 libraries worldwide, whereas the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition produces Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, exposing an industry in denial. It's only in 33 libraries around the world. Now, Stratfordians will triumphantly just, take for granted that they have this mainstream acceptance because of the, truthfulness of their claims as opposed to the alleged absurdity of ours. But what this frame tells us is that what we're looking at is the instruments, the structures of value in the academy, in publishing industries, and in library collection development. But that even though these authorities are given precedence now, that may change over time. Frame three, research as inquiry. Even though some Stratfordians admit that direct evidence linking Shakespeare to the works is scant or non-existent, and even Sir Stanley Wells admitted this in his chapter in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, yet questioning the assumption of Shakespeare's authorship and following the evidence honestly is rejected, ridiculed, demonized, and in fact, pathologized. So Joseph Rosenblum writes in the Definitive Shakespeare Companion that no evidence for other candidates can exist. Edmondson and Wells again write that all alternative candidates are equally invalid. None has a greater claim. All the suggestions rest on equally false premises. Well, both of these statements are completely fallacious. You can't just have this universal godlike declaration that certain knowledge can never exist without actually having an inquiry and looking into it. But these statements are not opening, they're not a foundation for inquiry. They're putting the lid on it. They're shutting off the possibility of inquiry. Edmondson and Wells again, and trust me, they were a bottomless well of quotes for this chapter, really quite endless. They wrote that the authorship question is ultimately a dangerous phenomenon which can lead to conspiratorial narratives fueled by denials of historical evidence, as well as being an entirely parasitic phenomenon, attacking the truth in order to feed off of its lifeblood, attaching itself leech-like to a healthy body, because it is dangerous and immoral to question history. So not only are we cutting off inquiry, we are actually pathologizing having an open mind. Frame 4, information creation as a process. In 2014, the book Shakespeare and the Digital World was released, which explored Shakespeare on the web, videos, online courses, wikis, etc. But there was no reference made to any of the online production of post-Stratfordians or Oxfordians. No YouTube videos, no declaration of reasonable doubt, apart from a passing reference to conspiracy hubs. So they just made a blanket assumption about the underlying process, that it's all a conspiracy theory, and so all of that knowledge production could be ignored. Frame 5, searching as strategic exploration. Again, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, 2013, ignored 60 years worth of authorship scholarship. Rosenblum's chapter on the authorship question in the definitive Shakespeare Companion had a paltry, I think, 5 citations, a couple from the 1950s, 1960s, only one book from an authorship question perspective from the 1990s. So exhibiting, as most Stratfordian scholarship does, a deliberate, willful, strategic decision to avoid actually reading the work that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians produce, so that they can keep making their tired and frequently debunked statements. Finally, scholarship as conversation. That we experience gatekeeping in scholarly journals, and the example I give is Richard Woggeman's 2014 paper that was submitted and accepted to the journal Memoria de Shakespeare, but when editor Gary Taylor comes on board, he pulls the article and compares the authorship question to Holocaust denial. The fact that we're totally excluded from mainstream Wikipedia Shakespeare articles, as Woggeman has pointed out, that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians may occasionally be accepted into mainstream peer-reviewed journals, but only if we self-censor our Oxfordianism. So what do we see then with these frames? Authority is constructed and contextual demonstrates that Stratfordians espouse and indeed demand an uncritical acceptance of their own authority. Information has value, reveals the extent to which current scholarly publishing practices lend unwarranted value to Stratfordian voices. Research as inquiry exposes Stratfordian scholarship as a closed circular system incapable of asking relevant questions about the biography of Shakespeare. Information creation as a process shows how these mechanisms of exclusion extend across all formats. Searching as strategic exploration demonstrates the willfully anemic, strategic and deliberate anemic sourcing in leading Stratfordian publications. And scholarship as conversation depicts an academic community actively excluding post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians from the scholarly conversation. So according to the criteria established by the American Library Association through the ACRL, Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices are inconsistent with this normative framework for sound scholarship. What can virtue epistemology theory tell us as well? That Stratfordians exhibit bad faith, poor epistemic conduct, and commit epistemic vice almost consistently when it comes to the authorship question and with addressing the claims of post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians. A particular epistemic vice that they use is the accusation of conspiracy theory as a mechanism of exclusion. And so as a result, we post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians suffer testimonial injustice. We are not believed, we are not listened to, we are not read. These rhetorics and practices perform what's called forum control in the discipline of Shakespeare studies, maintaining the epistemological system of Shakespeare biography. But what virtue epistemology theory tells us is that epistemic systems need to be robust, they need to be resilient. And what we see here is that the epistemic system of Shakespeare biography has a big hollow hole in the core of it that its practitioners are not addressing. And that the major way that they are buttressing this epistemic system is through acts of epistemic vice and perpetrating epistemic injustice and oppression. What we see here in this phenomenon, as we knew, of course, is that this is a significant but underexamined threat to academic freedom. And it limits the thinkable and the sayable for everyone who cares about Shakespeare, including Stratfordians themselves. And one of the ideas in virtue epistemology is that when you commit epistemic oppression, you are not just excluding people from knowledge production and forcing them to suffer, but you are actually oppressing yourself because you cannot know well if you are excluding other knowers. If you're not listening to them, if you're not reading them, your own knowledge production will be deficient. And so what we're seeing is, centuries of an impoverished and needlessly constrained discipline. The Shakespeare professoriate needs to grant academic freedom equally to post-Stratfordians and to themselves. They're denying themselves academic freedom as part of maintaining these institutional barriers that Jim identified. But they need to, because the grace of Shakespeare is that there is always another side to things. There is always doubt. Now, if you want to read more about my theorizing about the Stratfordian belief system, I'm going to explore that more fully in my upcoming article in the Oxfordian called Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief, where I use yet another external theoretical framework, that of the ethics of belief, to look at Stratfordian beliefs. So, questions or comments?
John Hamels asked, how do we break through this seemingly editing out and denial of any Oxfordian research? How do we promote change, in your opinion?
Well, I think pursuing through other disciplines is one route. Like, I think we can be going to rhetoric and communication. We go to conferences on the sociology of knowledge, contributing to journals of epistemology. I think being able to apply external theoretical frameworks to this phenomenon in a variety of disciplines can help expose what's been going on for so long, and that the English departments are holding themselves captive this way.
The Shelley Maycock makes a comment that the American Library Association violated their own mission statement in backing the Folger First Folio tour, which censored heavily and excluded analysis of their message. How do we bring pressures upon such organizations to expose their failures of consistency?
That is an interesting point. Although I will say that I actually published an online article through the journal American Libraries, which is the official organ, the magazine of the American Library Association, for the Folio Tour. And I was quite open about my Oxfordianism. And again, the editors had no problem at all accepting that. But yeah, I do think that would be a valid point to raise. Questioning institutions, and I think the Folger Shakespeare Library is another one prime for that. I wanted, though, to get back to a question that was raised for Jim. A part of the strategy about intellectual diversity is that I've recently joined the organization, the Heterodox Academy, which is trying to promote viewpoint diversity in the Academy. And I've actually pitched this very talk to them, and I'm scheduled to present it on May 7th. So hopefully, that can also contribute to spreading the word throughout the disciplines about the need for intellectual diversity in Shakespeare studies.
So we have the librarians and the historians on our side today. So excellent. Don Rubin asks, how has your paper been received by librarians and other knowledge workers? Have you had responses?
I have not heard. I've had a good relationship with the editors of the book, but I haven't heard anything from them about how it's been received. It was only published in November, so it's still early days. I haven't read a review of the book yet, but yeah, I will be curious. I will try to get this into library conferences as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your highly informative and philosophically based presentation, Michael. So much appreciate your perspective on this and your quotes of those mean-spirited Shakespeare birthplace trust dragons, wonderful things.
Thank you.
Well, it's time for me to turn the hosting duties back over to Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. Most of you know Cheryl. She's a teacher, writer, director, and producer of the wonderful documentary, Nothing is Truer Than Truth, which has been available on Amazon Prime for some time. And if you have not seen that film, it is time you clicked on that one. And it is soon to be released in the UK and Europe under a new title, Shakespeare, the Man Behind the Name. She was 2019 Oxfordian of the Year. And I think she has some wonderful treats for us to show in the several hours ahead that we still have in our program. So take it away, Cheryl. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Earl. And thanks to the presenters. These have been excellent presentations so far, really enjoying it. I wanted to talk about one of the unique programs sponsored by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. It's the Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest. I had the pleasure of working with Tom Renier, our esteemed colleague, former SOF president, on the development of the video contest. The mission of the contest is to promote evidence that supports reasonable doubt about who wrote Shakespeare's works and encourage its discussion. Beginning this year, we will have a new video award in Tom's memory, the Tom Renier Veritas Award. Submissions are now being accepted for the 5th annual Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest, and videos must be a maximum of 3 minutes in length. The idea, again, is that they would present an issue that promotes reasonable doubt about the traditional attribution of the Shakespeare works in a format that's entertaining, engaging, and witty. Videos should be predominantly in English language, but they're open to individuals in several different countries around the world. The deadline for submitting a video is July 20th, 2021, and you can find complete details about the rules, eligibility, and prizes this year at the website www.shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Today, we're going to look at a few of the past winners. And the first one we're going to view today is called Question Everything by Harry Tollefson, who won the 2nd place prize in the 2018 contest.
Hello, Professor. Olivia Connors here. I was in your English Lit class fall semester. Remember? I'm the one you shut down during class when I asked about the lost years in Shakespeare's life. You dismissed my question and rambled on about conspiracy theories and the authorship question. I didn't even know there was an authorship question. I was just confused. I mean, how could there be so little known about the famous Shakespeare when so much was known about his less famous contemporaries? So I did my own research. Spring break. I read 33 books on the subject and discovered that this authorship question is completely backward. No evidence that the Stratford man actually is the author. It's a lot of presumptions, no proof. Seems to me that the Stratfordian should be on the defense instead of, the other way around. Anyway, I'm making this little video to share my research. I'll talk fast and keep it short. Apparently, skepticism goes way back. Sigmund Freud, Walt Whitman, Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Helen Keller, Mark Twain wrote a whole book questioning authorship. Actors, authors, statesmen, Supreme Court justices, plenty of skeptics and questions like why was the Stratford man baptized Shakespeare, referred to as Shakespeare, and spells name different configurations of Shakespeare? Why no record of him attending university? Did you know the Stratford man didn't own a single book, play script, any letters, correspondence? I mean, he's a writer. He didn't write? He was never mentioned as a playwright within his own family or hometown. Wouldn't they want to brag? No eulogy at his funeral, no public mourning, but he was famous. So is it possible the Stratford upon Avon Shakespeare didn't really write Shakespeare? Then who did? Now this is where it really gets interesting. A British school teacher named Thomas Loney back in 1920 asked that question and approached the authorship as a detective trying to solve a crime. He came up with a profile based on the writings only, and after years of research, Loney found a match. A man obscured by time, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, a little-known author of poetry and plays in the court of Queen Elizabeth. Because of his title, he could only publish using a pseudonym. Lots of authors use them even today. Interesting idea, huh? In fact, de Vere's whole life was interesting, fascinating actually, although a little bit embarrassing for his family. He was a rich earl after all, with plenty of time and money for shenanigans. A life that actually paralleled Hamlet's. Best tutors, access to the best library in England, Cambridge University at 14, law school at 17, proficient in French, Latin, Greek, educated in medicine, military, mythology, seamanship, horsemanship, gardening. He spent a whole year traveling throughout Italy, Verona, Venice. De Vere owned 2 acting companies. And I love this. A Geneva Bible belonging to de Vere survived with handwritten notes in the margins used in Shakespeare's plays and sonnets. And where is this Bible now? In the Folger Shakespeare Library. What? Professor, just question. Like me, you'll find plenty of reasonable doubt. You're a student. Once I bet you question everything. Do we ever stop learning? Don't close the book, Professor. Just turn the page for the sake of all your students. Please.
Our next speaker is Julia Cleave, joining us also from the UK today. Julia holds an MA from Oxford University. She's a trustee of the Shakespearean Authorship Trust and a fellow of the Temenos Academy. In her career as a teacher and a teacher trainer, she taught Shakespeare in the context of training courses for foreign teachers and lecturers sponsored by the British Council. And for over 20 years, Julia has worked as an independent scholar, tracing the presence of Hermetic traditions in Renaissance and 17th century art and literature. She's a member of the Francis Bacon Research Trust and the De Vere Society, and today she will discuss how Shakespeare dared to present Queen Elizabeth on stage in the guise of Titania, in Midsummer Night's Dream, Portia in Merchant of Venice, and Olivia in Twelfth Night. The title of her talk is Excellent, I Smell a Device. Shakespeare, in 3 of his comedies, makes sport with a colorful cast of Queen Elizabeth's actual suitors, English, French, Spanish, German, and Swedish. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Cheryl, and greetings to everyone from England. It's wonderful to be with you all. I will now share my screen. So, excellent, I smell a device. The quote comes from Twelfth Night. It's Sir Toby expressing his delight at the trick that's about to be played upon Malvolio. Shakespeare seems to know more than he should about court secrets. So in daring to present Elizabeth in the guise of a Titania, a Portia, and Olivia, he makes sport with this colourful cast of the Queen's actual suitors. When she came to the throne in 1558, Elizabeth was considered the best marriage in the parish. And for the first half of her reign, a score of men paid court to her. Foreign kings, princes, dukes, and native earls and knights. Keeping them in play and at bay was all part of the serious game of high politics. I will be focusing on 7 of these would-be suitors. They're highlighted in red. Archduke Charles, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, King Eric of Sweden, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the Count Palatine, John Casimir, the French Prince, Francis, Duke of Alençon and Anjou, Sir Christopher Hatton, and Don John, bastard half-brother of King Philip of Spain, who is the Joker in this pack. The most prolonged of the Queen's formal courtships was with the Valois Prince, Francois. As heir to the French throne, he was known throughout Europe as Monsieur. To the English, he was simply Francis. To Elizabeth, in her many letters, he was her très cher Monsieur. All I do is dream. Hence, bizarrely, Bottom addressing the fairies no fewer than 11 times as Monsieur. Piquant details of their on-off affair are referenced in every scene of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I will come to one particular episode in a moment. Francis was her frog, on whom on occasion she doted. This was a mystery to the court, given that he was stunted in stature and spotted with pockholes. It was rumoured that she must be the victim of a love potion. My mistress with a monster is in love. Their courtship, pursued off and on over a dozen years, has been called one of the strangest wooings in history. Its course was anything but smooth. Elizabeth herself wrote of all these postponements. The voluminous correspondence archived in the Cecil Papers records all the impediments, difficulties, dangers, delays, hindrances, hazards, obstacles, objections, inconveniences, accidents, perils, lets and stays, empêchements and plus grand retardement that stood in the way of the match. And so that famous line, the path of true love never did run smooth. The dialogue between Lysander and Hermia in the opening scene of The Dream records these difficulties with startling accuracy. But either it was different in blood, oh cross, too high to be enthralled to low. Just as the Earl of Leicester had been mocked as Elizabeth's horsekeeper, so Alençon was regarded in some quarters as too low to look in Her Majesty's chamber door. On the other hand, his mother, naturally, disagreed. Queen Catherine de' Medici was reported as saying, if the Queen was disposed to marry, she saw not where she might marry so well, that as for those she had heard named, as the Emperor's son, or Don John of Austria, they were both less than her son, and of less stature by a good deal. Or else Miss Grafford in respect to years, oh spite, too old to be engaged too young. The two main obstacles to the French match were the difference in religion and the difference in age. Alençon at 17 was less than half the Queen's age. In a letter Elizabeth writes to Sir Francis Walsingham, she mentions the age problem no fewer than 9 times. We can find no other principal impediment but in the difference of the ages and the cause of religion, especially considering the youngness of the years of the Duke of Alençon being compared to ours, by reason of the difference in our ages. Sir Ralph Sadler, one of the Privy Councillors, opposed the match on the grounds that the Queen was too old to bear a child safely, but would also suffer her husband's scorn and neglect, since she would be well past her prime, while Anjou was in his best lust and flourishing age. And that verb misgrafford is suggestive of miscegnation. The Protestant John Stubbs, in his diatribe against the French match, called it an uneven yoking of the clean ox with the unclean ass. Or else it stood upon the choice of friends. Oh hell, to choose love by another's eyes. Sir Francis Walsingham wrote to Lord Treasurer Cecil, to one of her quality there is not allotted that choice that is to other common personages. On the left you see Catherine de' Medici with her brood of young princes, Charles, Henry and Francis. Each of them were presented to Queen Elizabeth as possible suitors. Elizabeth was sarcastic on the subject. She was obliged to the Queen Mother for having offered each of her children one after the other. The French wars of religion were another problem, pitting Catholics against Protestant Huguenots. William Camden's history refers to events in 1581. That at present many impediments and obstructions were in the way of the marriage, namely the civil war in France. And 2 years later, according to historian Martin Hume, the time had gone by for high-strained compliments and billing and cooing, and Alençon, in his letter to the Queen, says his mind is too full of war to talk about marriage. Queen Elizabeth herself remarked, "I would not be married to a war." Or if there were a sympathy in choice, war, death, or sickness did lay siege to it. Alençon had participated in the siege of La Rochelle in 1573. This attack on the Huguenots caused great alarm in England. The Queen to Valentine Dale, ambassador resident in France. The discovery of the late enterprise intended against those of Rochelle is the cause of our stay in answering the French in their request that Alençon should visit England. As a consequence, there is conceived in the hearts of our good subjects a new jealousy and misliking of this match. War, death, or sickness did lay siege to it. Lord Burleigh noted in August 1573, Alençon fell sick of the purples, an event reported also by William Camden. In the meantime, Alençon fell sick of the measles, which the Queen Mother signified to Queen Elizabeth by Gondy Count de Retz, and excused him by reason of his sickness that he came not into England. In June 1584, Alençon died prematurely, aged only 29. Sir Francis Walsingham reported, "Monsieur is dead. Melancholy doth so possess us, as both public and private causes are at a stay for a season." In fact, the Queen wore black and declared herself a widow. So this line in Shakespeare is now so familiar, to us it sounds proverbial. But no, in fact, it was entirely Shakespeare's invention. And what no one seems to have noticed is that of all the 7 reasons he gives for the thwarting of love, only one is remotely relevant to the story of the lovers in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the matter of personal choice. Hermia's father, Aegeus, wants her to marry Demetrius, not Lysander. Francis makes a second appearance in The Merchant of Venice among Portia's suitors. Nerissa asks, "What think you of the French lord, Monsieur Le Bon? God made him, and therefore let him pass for a man. He is every man in no man. If a throstle sing, he falls straight a capering." Editors of the 2 plays note that bottom is also associated with the singing of a throstle. But they don't get the joke. Translate throstle into French and you get maudit, the name of the French ambassador to the English court, who was present throughout the years of their courtship and closely involved in the marriage negotiations, was Sieur de la Mauvisière. It was to his tune that the Duke often had to dance. But first, there is the Neapolitan prince. Aye, that's a colt indeed, for he doth nothing but talk of his horse, and he makes it a great appropriation to his own good parts, that he can shoe him himself. I am much afeard my lady his mother played false with a smith. This is Don John, Philip II's half-brother, whose naval base was in Naples, at that time part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. The details are all almost deliciously true. He was famous for his horsemanship, his skill in taming unmanageable horses. And he was a bastard. His father, the Emperor Charles V, had had an affair with a singer called Barbara Blomberg. And for entirely political reasons, briefly in 1575, it was Elizabeth who wooed him. How like you the young German, the Duke of Saxony's nephew? This is Count Palatine, John Casimir, our ally in the Netherlands wars. He wrote a letter to Elizabeth in 1564, asking for her hand, but was rejected. Portia also rejects him, very vilely in the morning when he is sober, and most vilely in the afternoon when he is drunk. I pray thee, set a deep glass of Rhenish wine on the contrary casket. I know he will choose it. Casimir was responsible for the creation of the largest wine barrel in the world at Heidelberg Castle, full therefore of Rhenish wine. And now he beginneth to have a beard come forth. Now back to the dream and to a running joke about beards. One of the embarrassing aspects of the French match was the fact that at 17, Duke Francis was less than half the Queen's age. This led, so he was 17 to her 38. This led his mother to inform the English ambassador, Sir Thomas Smith, delightedly. And now he beginneth to have a beard come forth. From one Francis to another. In the play, it is Francis Flute who exclaims, "Let me not play a woman, I have a beard coming." The reference becomes undeniable in the rehearsal scene when Bottom agrees to play the part of the lover Pyramus. He asks Quince, "What beard were I best to play it in?" and proceeds to rifle through the rude mechanical's prop box. "I will discharge it in either your straw-colour beard, your orange tawny beard, your purpling grain beard, or your French crown-colour beard, your perfect yellow." Quince says, "Some of your French crowns have no hair at all, and then you will play barefaced." What on earth is all this about? And as footnote, I should mention that one of the name Quince matches one of the Duke's envoys to the English court, Jean de Coincey. French crown colour beard, your yellow, is a triple hit at Alençon. He was mocked as an imp of the crown of France. He loved money, and yellow is the colour of the French crown, the gold écu. He himself was perfect yellow, notorious for his failures on the battlefield, and a general swipe at the French, hairlessness could be a sign of syphilis, to the English known as the French pox. But what of the other surreal coloured beards, the straw colour and the purple? It so happens that they fit with two of the Queen's most important suitors. In the early years of her reign, the Swedish and imperial representatives were courting at a most marvellous rate. This is according to Bishop John Jewell. Straw colour matches the colouring of the blonde-bearded King Eric of Sweden, and purple in grain accords with Archduke Charles of the Imperial House of Habsburg. Since Roman times, purple had been the imperial colour. But who owns an orange tawny beard? This is a particularly teasing clue, since it could apply to any one of the three leading favourites of the Queen among the English courtiers of the 1570s and 80s. All three have a touch of ginger. Most famously and lastingly, the Queen's affections were bestowed on the Earl of Leicester. He was her sweet Robin. But in this context, in the dream, their relationship, at the height of the French courtship, turned sour. It is figured in the quarrel and estrangement between Oberon and Titania. Leicester was madly jealous, reported as cursing the French. His favour with the Queen briefly eclipsed, since he had secretly married M.L.I.S. Each accused the other of infidelity. These are the forgeries of jealousy. The Earl of Oxford, decidedly ginger in colouring, but he was only in high favour in the 1570s and 80s. In the 1570s. By the 1580s, he was in deep disgrace. Like Oxford, Sir Christopher Hatton first attracted Elizabeth's attention through the dancing and his skill at the tilt. And there are two good reasons for him being the chosen target here. I discovered a direct reference to him sporting an orange tawny beard in this tale of Sir Christopher Hatton in London. It's a fantastical story involving time travel and cross-dressing. Will he not be amazed to see Sir Christopher Hatton in a white silk bodice instead of a wrought jerkin, a tall hat, and a spruce orange tawny beard? But there is a true story to tell of Hatton's assiduous wooing of Elizabeth and his presumption in aspiring to be her lover. The story is lampooned in a third Shakespeare comedy, in Twelfth Night. What particularly irked his fellow courtiers about Hatton was the contrast between his common origins and his spectacular rise to a string of the highest offices in the land, all gifted to him by the Queen. So he was not born great, and his rivals did not consider he achieved greatness. But he certainly had greatness thrust upon him. A gentleman commoner who rose to become Lord Chancellor and Knight of the Garter. So there's my claim. All the defining tropes and code words associated with Hatton's rising at court, an elevation which seems to have aroused envy and mockery in equal measure, are worked into the fabric of the comedy and focused in the figure of Malvolio. Hatton was Vice-Chamberlain of the Queen's household. Malvolio was steward of Olivia's household. Both aspired to enter their lady's chamber. Hatton's personal posy was Felix in Fortunatus, or alternatively Fortunatus in Felix. Hence the sign-off to the hoax letter, the instrument of Malvolio's downfall, the fortunate unhappy. In the dialogue you are about to hear, seemingly inconsequential banter between Sir Toby and Sir Andrew Aguecheek, Shakespeare packs a punch with at least 7 palpable hits at Hatton. But first, to show that Shakespeare was not alone in seeking to satirize Hatton's success at court, we have on record 2 entertainments, one dating from about 1580, penned by the Earl of Oxford, and one by Ben Jonson, dating from 1603. During the 1570s, there was quarrelling and bitter rivalry between Hatton and Oxford. Hence this listing of a device now presumed lost. A pleasant conceit of Vere, Earl of Oxford, discontented at the rising of a mean gentleman in the English court, circa 1580. Ben Jonson, on more than one occasion, hit at Hatton as a one-trick wonder, attributing his elevation to his dancing feet. Holmby was his magnificent prodigy house in Northamptonshire. Nearby was Althorpe, home of the Spencer family. The entertainment at Althorpe was performed before Queen Anne in 1603. The maskers dance before Anne, but none of these doth hope to come by wealth to build another Holmby. All those dancing days are done. Men must now have more than one grace to build their fortunes on, else our souls would sure have gone all by this time to our feet. Now back to Twelfth Night, and as you listen to the dialogue, note the following, and especially Shakespeare's brilliant pun on caper. As Vice-Chamberlain, Hatton was involved in organising masques and revels. He was regarded as socially inferior by his rivals at court. He was the dancing chancellor who came into court by the galliard. Elizabeth's pet name for him was Mutton or Sheep. He fantasized about becoming the Queen's lover. Mary, Queen of Scots, claimed he was. In 1583, he commissioned the sieve portrait of his mistress. His social elevation was entirely due to his legs. Ha ha. Now we have the dialogue, which I hope the recording will play, where Annabel Leventon and Sir Mark Rylance will read. Right, I'm going to go back. Sorry, I seem to have lost that. We'll need to recover it. So I will read the dialogue myself. So Sir Andrew starts off and Sir Toby follows. I am a fellow of the strangest mind in the world. I delight in masques and revels, sometimes all together. Art thou good at these kickshaws, knight? As any man in Illyria, whatsoever he be, under the degree of my betters, and yet I will not compare with an old man. What is thy excellence in a galliard, knight? Faith, I can cut a caper, and I can cut the mutton to it. I think I have the back trick simply as strong as any man in Illyria. Wherefore are these things hid? Wherefore have these gifts a curtain before them? Are they like to take dust, like Mistress Moll's picture? Why dost thou not go to church in a galliard and come home in a coranto? I did think by the excellent constitution of thy leg, it was formed under the star of a galliard. Aye, 'tis strong, and it does indifferent well in a flame-coloured stock. Shall we set about some revels? What shall we do else? Were we not born under Taurus? Taurus? That's sides and hearts. No, sir, it is legs and thighs. Let me see thee caper. Ha! Higher! Ha ha! Excellent! So here is evidence that Shakespeare was privy to court insider gossip and burlesqued it on the stage. Like Bottom, he can gleek upon occasion, meaning he can make pointed jests about real situations. But while Dr. Samuel Jonson suspected this, I'm always inclined to believe that Shakespeare has more allusions to particular facts and persons than his readers generally suppose. Perhaps in this enumeration of Portia's suitors, there may be some covert allusions to those of Elizabeth. Modern scholars, blinkered by the limitations of the Stratford biography, are entirely incurious or in denial. Thus Helen Hackett, author of a book-length study, Shakespeare and Elizabeth, The Meeting of Two Myths, can observe in her introduction to A Midsummer Night's Dream, curiously, Shakespeare's works hardly ever mention Elizabeth, while Professor Bate states boldly, It is absurd to suppose that any Elizabethan play might contain satiric references to particular aristocrats of the day. This is scholarly dereliction. To persist in ignorance or denial is to miss half the meaning and half the fun. And those things do best please me that befall preposterously.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. We have time for one question, if anyone would like to pose a question. Mine would be, how did Oxford get away with this lampooning of the Queen? We can't imagine the Stratford man getting away with it, but even Oxford was taking quite a risk. What do you think? What's your theory?
Well, I think the two questions to pose is, how did he know and how did he dare? And when I first gave a version of this research, it was actually in the Tower of London at a 3-day conference all about Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana. And I've since done a lot of extensive research drawing on the Cecil papers that Kevin was mentioning earlier. And I've actually submitted a major paper to the Huntington Library Quarterly, which has been accepted for peer review, but it's been languishing with them for rather a long time.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It does sort of speak to the strategies that have been discussed earlier, that my idea of going to the Huntington, not only because of its prestige, but also because it included historians as well as literary scholars.
Yes.
And, you know, I think if they see the evidence, it's pretty uncontrovertible that Shakespeare knew an awful lot, particularly about the courtship of the Duke of Alençon.
Great. Thank you so much. That's so exciting about your paper. Wonderful. And we're going to go next to our next speaker. Thank you again, Julia. I'd like to introduce Roger Strittmatter. Roger is Professor of Humanities at Coppin State University and was the 2013 Oxfordian of the Year. He's the author of The Marginalia of Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. That was his 2001 Ph.D. thesis, which explores parallels between the biblical references in the works of Shakespeare and hundreds of hand-marked verses in Oxford's personal copy of the Geneva Bible. With Gary Goldstein, he established Brief Chronicles, an interdisciplinary journal of authorship studies, and served as general editor of that journal from 2009 to 2016. He's written over 100 authorship-related articles, many in orthodox academic journals, including the Shakespeare Yearbook, Review of English Studies, and Notes and Queries. He's the author with Lynn Kazitsky of On the Date, Sources, and Design of Shakespeare's The Tempest, and the editor of the Brief Chronicles book editions, including the Shakespeare Authorship Source Book for educators. His presentation today focuses on the hidden meaning of Jonson's epigram To the Reader, facing the folio's Drouchet engraving. It's titled Witty Numbers, Ben Jonson's First Folio Jest in Context. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you. So I guess everybody can see my first slide here. I want to first of all say congratulations, Julia, on even getting seriously considered at the Huntington Library Quarterly. If you succeed in publishing that, it's a great thing for all of us. So thank you for pushing on that. And Michael Dudley has been talking about networks of knowledge as part of his talk. And I did a little back of the envelope calculation. It's very rough, but I can safely say that there's over 100 years of accumulated experience represented in the talks that are here today. So I think that's an accomplishment for all of us. So witty numbers, Ben Jonson, Shakespeare, First Folio, Jest in Focus. For literate Elizabethans or Jacobeans, there was no reason to bother reading a book in which the most interesting meaning was obvious. Reading was a labor that required concentrated attention. A worthy text repaid an enlarged understanding through many reviews. Books were not only written, but designed and built to last for many hundreds of years, not to be discarded when the next theory arrived. Books talked to one another, and smart readers could overhear the details. Renaissance rhetoricians, poets, and philosophers all practiced what Winston Churchill preached. The truth must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. Anything else, they thought, and they had scripture for it, was to throw pearls to swine. And there is one man, one writer, who of all others who lived during Shakespeare's lifetime and was privy to all the literary gossip of the day, who was the acknowledged grand master of the practice of esoteric reasoning in verse. His name was Ben Jonson. Honest Ben Jonson, as he was sometimes known, and he's the man who wrote the verses that accompany Shakespeare's face, which you see here. According to Stratfordians, quote, Ben Jonson must be answered first, by which they mean we safely assume he's on our side, we think anyway. This assumes, however, that Ben Jonson has been correctly understood, which is the premise in question. I contend that Ben Jonson cannot be answered until he is first understood. Yet Ben Jonson is still a foreign planet to the average Shakespeare scholar. Let's visit the planet and see what we can find. So this is the title page of Jonson's book of epigrams in 1616. And let's just take a minute to check out some of the features that are visible on this title page. This is an exercise in reading what are called paratexts, the preliminary matters of a book, including title pages, dedications, engravings, etc. And according to the distinguished literary historian Gerard Genet, a paratext is, quote, more than a boundary or a sealed border. It is rather a threshold, a zone between text and off text. So what does Jonson do on this title page that's of interest to us? Well, first of all, it is quite curious that let me find my laser pointer here. He actually writes the phrase, the author, on the title page. To my knowledge, this had never been done before this time, and I doubt if it was done very often after that. By doing so, he emphasizes his agency and control through what is technically a superfluous expression. And this is possibly the first time it was done on an English book. Sorry, I got to put my laser back. Okay. On the same line, Jonson paradoxically shrinks his full name to his initials. B.I. Remember those initials because we're going to see them more as we continue in this. And what do initials do? Well, initials condense the force of a name, just as epigrams are. They're a form of compressed and possibly a little bit explosive nickname. But what is an epigram anyway? I realize this is pretty basic. Let's go over this. It's a short, witty poem, often of a satiric character, which has to conclude with some type of a point or a jab, terse, pointed, and witty with a sting to it. And here's an interesting example. This is Ben Jonson's epigram 77 in the volume of which we were just looking at the title page. It is called the To One That Desired Me Not to Name Him. Be safe, nor fear thyself so good a fame, that anyway my book should speak thy name. For if thou shame, ranked with my friends to go, I am more ashamed to have thee thought my foe. The addressee to this day among Ben Jonson scholars is unknown. However, the addressee of the epigrams is very well documented, and it is this man, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. Now, in this dedication, Jonson traverses, again, unprecedented literary territory when he mixes epigrams and cryptograms. He doesn't actually use the word cryptogram, he uses the word cipher, but it's the same for our purposes, the same thing. In 1616, when the book was published, Pembroke was the newly minted Lord Chamberlain of King James' household, and therefore the most powerful theatrical official in England. He was also the richest man in England and the most vigorous arts patron across many media and genres, including drama. Pembroke's brother, Philip Herbert, as many of you may know, was married to the youngest daughter of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, an aristocratic family that Jonson would remember in part through the gift of a copy of Plato from the 18th Earl in the years shortly after the publication of his epigrams and before the folio. My lord, he writes to Pembroke, while I cannot change your merit, I dare not change your title. It was that made it. In other words, it was your merit that made the title, and not I, under which name I here offer to your lordship the ripest of my studies, my epigrams, which, though they carry danger in the sound, do not therefore seek your shelter. For when I made them, I had nothing in my conscience to expressing of which I did need a cipher. All right. So we talked about what an epigram is, but what's a cipher? The complexity of the word cipher is shown by the fact that the most obviously applicable definition to Jonson's use only ranks 5th in the OED, and that is a secret or disguised act of writing. At root, a cipher is a zero, an absence, something that is missing. While Jonson is claiming to Pembroke that his motives are so pure that he has no need of any secret or disguised manner of writing, his long history of legal troubles and literary evasions justifies seeing the denial as an ironic pose. Thus, the very mention of cipher invites curiosity, while the entire statement declares an innocence that contradicts everything that is known about the famously canny and elusive Jonson, the man who left ciphers, at least of a metaphorical kind, all over his work. There was, of course, a reason why Jonson and many other Elizabethans were interested in ciphers. In a word, the rack. This is a useful quotation from Lucy Baldwin Smith's Treason in Tudor England. Secrecy was a social and political obsession, which was regarded as one of the basic laws of nature. For the whole world knew that wild beasts dwell in dens, fishes bed in mud, and birds in nests. And a wise man is wrapped up in secrecy. And while I have this image up here, let me recommend to you Paul L. Trokey's article about this image, A Portrait Analysis of William Cecil, a heretofore unknown story hidden in plain sight, in Shakespeare Matters 1:1. And I didn't write down the date of that, but you should be able to find it. This is, in fact, almost certainly a true life representation of William Cecil bending over Cuthbert Simpson on the rack. So not only Elizabethan society, but Ben Jonson, even to a much greater degree, is obsessed with the theme of secrecy. Professor William Slates, in this University of Toronto publication in 1994, Ben Jonson and the Art of Secrecy, a book written after at least around 20 years of studying Jonson intensively, writes, as I have struggled with the interpretive problems of Jonson's middle plays over the years, I have become convinced that the driving social force, distinctive dramatic techniques, and persistent interpretive puzzles in these plays are related one way or another to the topic of secrecy. And this brings me to the conclusion of my introduction of Ben Jonson. So now we know a little bit about him. He lived in an age of paranoia and few books that were designed to last and be read for a long time. He writes about cryptograms and books of epigrams, and he is I haven't introduced this quote yet because I had to cut out the slide to shorten a little bit. He is the, quote, most proportioned wit and wonder of a learned age. The most proportioned wit and wonder of a learned age. So let's see what this most proportioned wit and wonder of a learned age did. The first folio, as we know, is among the most iconic books in the world. It's been an object of intensive scholarly inquiry for well over 200 years, actually. And the tercentenary of it was celebrated in 1923. So we're headed into the 400th anniversary. Strangely enough, however, that 400th anniversary was already celebrated in 2016 by the Folger Library. And I think that as we think about strategy and how to move forward, it would be useful to stare this kind of big deception straight in the face. Why was the folio the main focus of an event that really was celebrating the 400th anniversary of the death of the poet? So what we do have here, though, in the first folio is really, I think this is an arresting design. I think that this image is powerful. It is not incompetent. When you look at it, you feel like someone is looking back at you. And that's one of the things that it was designed to do. But there is a history of misinterpretation and misunderstanding here by the experts. The Folger claimed to be contextualizing the folio in its 2016 tour. I do not believe that they did so, and I'm going to try to do a little bit of that contextualization here for you. Or with you. So let's look at some of this misunderstanding. This is Robert Giraud, the publisher, who was also a Shakespeare, wrote books about Shakespeare in the New York Times. Ben Jonson is the unanswerable argument against idiotic beliefs that Shakespeare's plays were written by somebody else like the Earl of Oxford. And Ian Donaldson in 2011, quote, vouching for the fact that Martin Droeshout's engraving was indeed for gentle Shakespeare cut, and to the lasting confusion of those wishing to propose an alternative authorship, that the person depicted was indeed responsible for the works presented in this volume. Now, Professor Donaldson is described in The Guardian as, quote, a leading Jonson scholar for decades and an editor of the 7-volume Cambridge edition of the works published in 2013. However, despite these impressive credentials, I don't think we are as confused as Professor Donaldson supposes. Like so many others, he has been content to tackle the problem of Jonson's epigram by expressly ignoring all the difficult bits. Jonson calls, let me get my pointer here, so maybe I can, Jonson calls this image a figure, and in various other respects undermines the reader's confidence in the poem's smoothly polished surfaces, calling attention both to the engraving itself as well as objects that have been cut and put like cards in a game in which Jonson seems to be holding some invisible cards. All these literary suggestions of duplicity are ignored by Donaldson and every other Orthodox expert that I have read. Let's read the poem together. To the reader, this figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit as well in brass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. So I believe there's a secret message hiding in plain sight here, and it could be analyzed in various different ways. We'll look at several possibilities. The first thing to notice is that this presentation of a book or an author is abnormal in 1623. And in a minute, I'm going to show you Ben Jonson's first folio, and you'll understand a little bit better what I mean by abnormal. But what we also can see, even before we move on, is that we have a title page on the recto side of the page, and over here on the verso, before the title page, we have got Ben Jonson's poem. This means that from a literary point of view, Jonson's verses are literally placed what's called hysteron proteron before the title page. Hysteron proteron means the cart before the horse. Puttenham in the Art of English Poesy, and I realize Puttenham is in quotes here because some people do not believe that Puttenham is the author, but the Art of English Poesy is generally considered to be written by him. So that book states that the figure of hysteron proteron is also the figure of the preposterous. The title page includes an image of the author. This is probably unprecedented, and I will thank Dorna Bewley in her master's degree from Brunel University on the folio for making it clear to me that the title page here was run through the press twice. This was not an easy thing to do. You had to go through once for the printing and another time for the engraving. So the engraving is square and spare, a figure without artifice, put there. It says put here in a way that would have seemed out of place in 1623. So this is a useful comparison here. Just getting caught up with myself. Ben Jonson on the right, his 1616 folio, and the Shakespeare folio on the left. And we can immediately see there are dramatic differences in the iconography and the style of these two pages. Jonson's title page is filled with ornate decoration. The engraving of the author is surrounded by what is called a trimming oval with integrated text in it. Text and image are integrated in Jonson's folio, and text and image are disassociated in the Shakespeare folio. This contrast can be shown with literally dozens of early modern title pages. All of them, or almost all of them, will look much more like Jonson's than the Shakespeare folio. All of this is so obvious that Leah S. Marcus, the former president of the, past president of the M.L.I. and a distinguished Shakespeare scholar, in 1988, in her book Puzzling Shakespeare, speaks of the prefatory materials, not just the Droeshout engraving, but the engraving and Jonson's poem as iconoclastic, Protestant, and rhetorically turbulent. And then she says, Jonson's poem abolishes Shakespeare as an entity apart from his writing. The folio paratexts set the reader off on a treasure hunt for the author. Where is the real Shakespeare to be found? Now, I should have to include here, since we're also talking about networks of knowledge and forms of suppression of knowledge, I do not believe this book has ever received the attention it deserves among Orthodox scholars because Leah Marcus was too honest. And I do not think that it has probably helped her career very much. Before we move on, oh, no, that's going to be in the next slide. Thank you. Yes. Okay, here we go. So we're going to look at this a couple more times. We've read it once. In the 16th century, to write numbers was to write poetry. Jonson's followers called him the Prince of Numbers, the Prince of Numbers. And they also called him author of authors. Well, what kind of numbers do we see here? And why is Jonson the author of authors anyway? Well, this is a 10-line iambic tetrameter epigram. That means that it has 4 iambic feet in every line. So we see just by this analysis the way in which for early modern writers, poetry and number are closely integrated. By the way, this form is extremely unusual in Jonson. I will not declare that he never uses it, but it's very rare. I found few, if any, others. This contains multiple allusions to copper plate engraving, brass engraving, and card playing. The words put, cut, strife, drawn, and hit, at least, all are relating to card playing. And I thank Julie Bianchi for bringing this out for us. So many of you may have heard Alexander Waugh's excellent treatment of what I'm about to show you, but it is important to me, and I think for all of us, to share the backstory. Neither Alexander Waugh nor I am the originator of this idea. Meet the originator of what I'm about to show you, Charlotte Armstrong, an American author of 29 published novels and numerous short stories, plays, and screenplays. I have recently spoken to Ms. Armstrong's son and to her estate, and have verified that she was a committed Shakespeare authorship researcher before her death in 1969. Now, there are those who will believe that by definition, novelists are not scholars. And those people may find cause for ridicule or abuse in me even daring to introduce to you someone who is most well known as a novelist. But I was struck by Kevin Gilvary's account this morning of the wholly fictional character of all orthodox biographies of Shakespeare. And so perhaps it is fitting that a mere novelist should puncture that illusion, as well as I think she does in this book, 7 Seats to the Moon. So I've got 2 short excerpts here directly scanned from the book. And I'm not going to try to give you too much context. We have a conversation here between the protagonist of the novel, who's named Jay, and his father, who for many pages by this point has been working on trying to figure out the Shakespeare problem, and has been working on the first folio and on Jonson's epigram for several hundred pages, or a couple hundred pages anyway. Just where do you see this cipher, Father? Jay asked gently. You know what a poetic foot is? Here, slash those lines into feet. 4 to a line. Here, I've done it. Jay looked at the paper on which his father had done it. Now, the handout that Earl mentioned is available for you. I created a handout. You can do this yourself. I encourage you to do it. I think if you do it yourself, you will understand by doing at least as well as you will by understand by me trying to explain it to you. But each of these divisions is 2 feet. This fig, you're that, thou here, seest put. Those are the first 4 feet of the first line. Now, said his father, pointing to the signature, B is the second letter in the alphabet. I and J, in those times interchangeable, make up the 9th letter. 9 and 2 add up to 11. You agree? You will agree. So count to the 11th foot, extract it from that, count to the 9th foot following, extract it, count 11 more, and then 9. In other words, it's 2 counts of 11, 9. It is not, his father mourned, to be attacked as an improper cipher. Reason tells me so. Jay did what he'd been told to do and read off the result. Vere had his wit. Vere writ his book. Well, well, Jay was impressed. I should explain what gematria is. Gematria is the science and theory of exchanging numbers for letters, which is what we've just read about. It is an ancient practice used not only by Hebrew scholars, but by intellectuals of many faiths and traditions. And it is also a foundational concept in the theory of cryptography. The second thing we need to carry with us before we move on is that 11 is going to be a significant number in Jonson's puzzle. So let's place this modern decryption in a more historical context. In Giambista della Porta's 1572 Concerning Concealed Notes of Literary Things, which, as I'm going to show you in just a minute, Jonson was quite aware of, contains something, an image of what is called a Cardano grill, which is a way of creating secret writing by placing, by first writing within the open spaces in the grill and then filling in the other spaces. So Armstrong's solution is anticipated by this method, which was created by the great Renaissance polymath Jerome Cardan, who many of you will know as the author of Cardanus Comfort. And here we have the picture from Della Porta's 1572 book. The use of this system requires the use of a pair of templates, 2 templates with cutouts on them. The encrypted message is first inserted through the template onto the page, and then removing the grill, the sender completes the message by filling in the gaps. Reading the message is as simple as superimposing the second grill over the document. But for those without this second grill, the encrypted message is secured by the appearance of innocence in the cover text. And I think Alexander Waugh has touched on some of this in his recent videos. Now, Jonson knew about Porta. This is an important link here. This is a poem that is a complaint against Jonson's superficial critics, written or published, written in 1623. These critics will buy the names of books that they've never read, and they presume to be more informed and think they know more about secrets of state than Jonson does. Or every day, someone at Rhymy's looks or bills. I'll talk about those 2 words in just a minute. And there he buys the names of books. They all get Porta, for the sundry ways to write in cipher and the several keys to ope the character. They have found the slate with juice of lemons, onions, pistorite to break up seals and close them. So Bills and Rhymy are the names of 2 London booksellers. Bills actually used to travel to buy books for the Bodleian Library. So there are 2 interpretations possible here. Does Jonson satirize the fashionable readers of Porta because he himself scorns the concept of secret writing? Or can he make better use of Porta than they can, avoiding such simplistic and easily broken cipher systems as writing with the juice of lemons? Jonson was an insider and eventually government witness in the gunpowder plot trial, and he probably knew about documents in the case written in quote unquote invisible ink, also known as orange juice. Such documents were discovered because, quote, the size of the paper and the smallness of the apparent contents roused suspicion, and the letters were examined and used in evidence against Garnet, according to Jonson biographers Herford and Simpson. So this is what this looks like if we impose a Cardano grill over this. That's exactly what I did. I created a grill here over the underlying image, and we can see that it says Vere had his wit, Vere writ his book. And it also has a kind of a nice doubling cascade effect. So to the reader is followed with a twice encrypted identification of the author as someone named Vere. U, of course, equals V. These are interchangeable letters in early modern typography. Or not entirely interchangeable, but they're used, they sometimes replace one another compared to what we would do. The poem is constructed by first filling in the cutouts with the message and then composing around them. But what Ben Jonson did is to modify this idea using the math of poetic meter. No grill is needed because the form supplies the template. Have we found the real author yet? So this here I've done this where you can see the feet. So we've counted to 11 feet, to 9 feet, to 11 feet, and 11 and 9 feet more. And we have the same result that we had in the Cardano grill, but we didn't need to use any physical object to do it. How do we get here? Well, we have to come back to this issue of BI. So BI is the key. Jonson used his own initials as a key. In the simplest gematria formula, which you can actually see here, this is from the Della Porta book. You can see that B aligns with 2 and I aligns with 9. Now these wheels for cryptographic purposes can be spun against one another, so that is not a fixed equation, but it's the 0 point where everybody would have started. And together those numbers make 11. 11, we shall see, is encoded in multiple ways in the design of the first folio paratexts. But
So,
why
Roger,
Vere? Yeah.
May I interrupt and just let you know that we're over time? And so
I'm sorry.
If you can wrap up, that
Yes,
would be
I will.
great. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you for letting me know, because I couldn't see the time. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. Oops, I guess I got to share my screen again. And all right, so I'm going to just go right down to, I was going to talk to you about why Vere, okay, and give you some interesting examples. But I'm going to switch. I'm going to go just directly to this slide, and then I'll wrap it up. So I told you that we were going to find the number 11 all over the place in this document, and I've counted, and it's pretty clear. The total number of feet in Ben Jonson's two poems in the folio is 440. The total number in the contributions of the other three poets are 220 in 44 lines. And those are divided right in half between the 22 lines and 110 feet of Holland and the 22 lines and 110 feet of the other two contributors. That is a pretty precise numerical arrangement. So since I'm out of time, I'm not going to be able to talk to you about containers within containers. Let's just finish with this. This is a summary of what we've been looking at. On the left-hand side is what the container says, what the envelope says, what the exterior form of Jonson's epigram says. It says the engraving was for gentle Shakespeare cut. It says that art and nature had a strife in the cutting. Therefore, the graver cannot draw the author's wit. Therefore, the reader should look on his book. But what do we learn when we study the inner form? Well, first of all, we realize that cut emphasizes artifice, card playing, and for can mean not of. The engraving is cut for the gentle Shakespeare, and the primary Jacobean meaning of gentle is noble. As we know, De Vere was a nobleman who wrote under other names. And then finally, directly from the cryptogram, Vere had his wit, Vere writ his book. So I'm not going to talk to you about Plutarch. I want to talk. Oh, I'll do this as last one. Okay, this is one of Jonson's sources. And Plutarch tells Jonson, tell the truth, but don't get killed for it. Instead, he says, give your mind to the matter. He's talking about the Delphic oracle in Greece. There were naturally some things to which it was well that despots should fail to understand and enemies should not learn beforehand. About these, therefore, he put a cloak of intimations and ambiguities which concealed the communication so far as others were concerned. But he did not escape the persons involved nor mislead those who had need to know and who gave their minds to the matter. So thank you for giving your mind to the matter with me for a little over 30 minutes here. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks so much, Roger. We only had a couple of questions. One from Brian Wildenthal. Were the epigrams included in Ben Jonson's 1616 folio?
No, both the epigrams as a book. Yes, they were. That's one of the interesting things about Jonson's books. He always put separate title pages for every document in them. So there's a separate title page for the epigrams and several other categories of poetry, but it was all published as one book. Yeah.
Great. And Yvonne noted that she had read that, as clearly the engraving was cut for Shakespeare, not of. So that distinction, I think, is clear to people who read closely. But thank you so much for sharing this information. And if people do have questions, we will forward them to Roger and look forward to hearing more about Charlotte. That was really fascinating. And I'll
thank you.
See you again in the panel in a little bit. Thanks, Roger. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dorothea Dickerman. And Dorothea is JD, she started asking questions whether Will of Stratford really wrote the Shakespeare canon when she was just 10 years old. She wrote, after graduating from Amherst College, summa cum laude, and the University of Chicago Law School, she became a partner in a major law firm structuring real estate deals. She recently retired from law to research and write about the life of Oxford, hoping to answer her childhood question. Her talk today describes a thoroughly researched trip to Italy with her Harvard Law School educated husband, seeking to convince him that Oxford was the real Bard. The title of her talk is, The First Thing We Do, Let's Convince All the Lawyers. Welcome, Dorothea.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get a screen share here. Okay.
Yes.
You know the quote, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Sounds tempting, doesn't it? But I'm a lawyer and my husband, Rich, is an amazing lawyer. Princeton, Harvard Law School, partner in a major law firm, law professor, getting his master's in history, not a flat earther. Lawyers are annoying. We each think we're the smartest person in the room. So how do you convince opposing counsel that he's wrong? Especially when you live with him and you've been arguing about the Shakespeare authorship question for decades. Lawyers are particularly aware of the wide gulf between facts and opinions. We get allergic reactions to statement of fact that contain words like would have, could have, should have, must have, and undoubtedly did. And the lore on the man from Stratford overflows with such phrases. But to Rich, the name on the first folio was proof. He did not want to hear from me about the yawning chasm between the facts about Will and the Shakespeare canon's text. Now, he and I both know that in a court of law, direct and circumstantial evidence can be used to determine fact. Direct evidence comes from a person who saw, heard, or touched the object or situation at issue. Circumstantial or indirect evidence proves facts based on other facts or circumstances. Rich claimed that only direct evidence could change his mind, like the plays in Oxford's hand, or for that matter, in Will of Stratford's hand, assuming that Will could write more than his name, unlike his parents, his wife, and his adult children. The search has continued for centuries, but no plays, poems, notes, or letters exist in Will of Stratford's hand, and thus we have no direct evidence that he wrote the plays either. I could walk you through Rich's objections and my responses, but trust me, I tried everything. We were at impasse. Finally, Rich admitted that the lawyer's identity did not matter to him. Although acknowledging the bard's reputation, Rich found the canon uninteresting, except the history plays, because they transported him back in time, like to the field at Agincourt. It struck me that he did not realize that the entire canon is an eyewitness tutor history lesson with real people the bard knew as characters. Maybe I could convince this lawyer. Stratfordians admit their man never left England. If I could show that only someone with direct personal experience of Italy could have written those plays, Rich might see that the bard could not be Stratford's Will. Then, if I could match heaps of Oxford's unique experiences and relationships in Italy to the plays, Rich might realize by circumstantial evidence that the bard is Oxford writing about his own life. Darling, this lawyer, Richard Rose, says in the Shakespeare Guide to Italy that 15 of the 38 plays are set there. Let's go find the actual places in the plays and see if Rose right, say Milan, Mantua, Verona, Padua, Venice. The distance between being a lawyer and a storyteller is insignificant. Whether in the courtroom or the court of public opinion, law is critical storytelling. We had traveled in Italy many times, but on this trip I went armed with Roe, my bard-targeted itinerary, the plays, and an armful of historical research, much of it in Italian. Andiamo a Italia. Oxford's route from London to Italy began in early February 1575 on the well-worn road through Canterbury to Dover, and there crossed the Channel to Calais. He was to represent his queen in Paris and Clam at Henri III's wedding and coronation as King of France. Henri had toured northern Italy the previous year and gave Oxford letters of introduction. During his 6 weeks in France, besides Henri, Oxford met other French royals who appear in the canon, including Henri's brother, the Duc d'Alençon, a suitor to Queen Elizabeth. To wait out the deep snow, Oxford visited Johann Sturmius in Strasbourg, and in April, he sailed up the Rhine to Basel and crossed the Alps using one of two routes. The first, via the St. Gothard Pass, would point him towards Milan. The other is the Venetian trade route, sailing Lake Constance and the Inn River to Innsbruck, and then, as 90% of travelers did, using the lower Brenner Pass to the Adige, and then south on the Mincio, directly for Mantua. I favor the second route, avoiding Spanish-controlled Milan. Even if longer by distance, travel by water is easier and safer, and Milan had virulent plague in 1575. Oxford wrote he dared not pass by Milan. What makes sense to me is that King Henri contacted his Italian traveling companion, the musical Duke of Mantua, Guglielmo Gonzaga, also newly Duke of Montferrat. Guglielmo invited Oxford, an excellent musician, to Mantua. We will visit Mantua and the Gonzaga shortly, but Rich and I went first to Milan. A few historical reminders about 1575 Italy. A peninsula named Italy existed then, but no country till 1861. Wealthy warlord families like the Sforzas of Milan, the Gonzagas of Mantua, and the Scaligi of Verona, whose leaders are prince or duke in the Italian plays, held a patchwork of fiefdoms. Spain owned Milan and Naples, making them hostile to England. Venice, with the Veneto, was an independent republic. The Pope ruled the Papal States and Rome, and England sought allies against Spain, and neither the fiefdoms nor the Venetians wanted to become another Spanish colony. But like squabbling siblings forced to unite, Rome, Venice, and the Papal States had allied as the Holy League and defeated the Ottomans at Lepanto 4 years before Oxford arrived. I explained to Rich that Stratfordians conveniently dismiss major clues that Will of Stratford wasn't the bard by labeling them his mistakes. For example, the references in Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Tempest, and Taming of the Shrew to sailing on tides and floods and ships and barks between Milan, Padua, and Verona are mistakes because he thought those places were coastal. This Italian map disputes that conclusion, showing hill fortresses throughout northern Italy connected by navigable waterways. Bucentars and Berchiellos ferried Isabel d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia as far east as Venice. If you could afford it, and Oxford could, barges under sail or tow were the way to go. Two maps of the center of Old Milan, one modern, one Renaissance. At 11 o'clock on the modern map, in a green space labeled Parco Sempione, is the Sforza Palace. The public gardens are at 1 o'clock. We will focus on the area between these two parks along the north perimeter of the old city, where the action at the end of Two Gentlemen occurs. The bard describes that area's physical features precisely, but mentions nothing else specific about the rest of Milan. Given that, the plague and Spanish rule, it seems to me that Oxford sailed by this north perimeter, but never entered Milan. Like most Milanese canals, the outer and inner ring canals, the Naviglio Grande and the Naviglio Interno, are now streets. Although it appears landlocked, Renaissance Milan, like most northern Italian cities, had walls with gates and connected to other cities and the sea through canals and rivers. That canal water doesn't disappear. It has to go someplace. Rowe wrote that the Naviglio Martesana, which enters Old Milan at its north perimeter and connects the ring canals to the Adda and the Tincio, runs under the Via Melchiorre Gioia. Rich and I walked north on it between the two parks to see. We were rewarded with the green, gorgeous Martesana Canal gushing through a grill to meet its ancient bed under our feet. Completed in 1573, you can sail on it today to Milan, as did the Two Gentlemen from Verona, and probably the Earl of Oxford, departing Italy for England. Exploring the Milan canals showed Rich that Rowe was right and Stratfordians not right, but it didn't prove who wrote the plays. I needed more evidence. Fortunately, my husband is endlessly fascinated by the plague. During the 1575 plague, the infected Milanese were consigned to live or die in the Lazaretto, a high-walled city of the diseased, located outside the public gardens and the Naviglio Martesana. This drawing shows the Lazaretto with the little churches of San Carlo at its center and San Gregorio just outside its walls. San Carlo, then an open-sided octagonal chapel to allow the 16,000 sufferers to receive Mass, was replaced later with a new church, now at the center of a beautiful residential neighborhood built right over the demolished plague-infested Lazaretto. While we watched the Lazaretto's 10-block perimeter, I told Rich the plot of two gentlemen. Boyhood friends, Valentine and Proteus, sailed from Verona to Milan to be presented to the emperor in 1533, when the real Holy Roman Emperor Charles V held court at Milan. They both fall for fair Silvia, the Duke of Milan's daughter. Proteus betrays Valentine, who is banished. Then, realizing one Thurio is also courting Silvia, Proteus says, "I'll quickly cross by some sly trick, blunt Thuria's dull proceeding, and lures him at night to St. Gregory's Well." Rowe identified St. Gregory's Well as the huge pit for dead plague victims in San Gregorio's courtyard. Researching in Italian, I found Renaissance maps and paintings of piles of bodies carted from the Lazaretto to San Gregorio through Il Porto Brutto and dumped into pits. It was clear to me that the bard experienced the horrors of the Lazaretto and St. Gregory's pit, probably by sight, sound, and smell from the Naviglio Martesana. Rich said, "I'd heard of the Milan Lazaretto. Rowe laid the groundwork from that play, and you expanded it with Italian resources. Impressive." Several scenes in Two Gentlemen are set outside the Sforza Palace. Like Milan's historic dukes, Prospero and Miranda lived there before the Tempest begins. Can you picture how father and daughter were hurried aboard a bark on the Ring canals, borne some leagues to the sea, to the Tyrrhenian Sea, on the Pavese Canal, which exists today, where they prepared a rotten carcass of a butt and sent to ride down the waves to an island? That's a tale from another bard-targeted trip. Mantua's claim to Shakespearean fame is Romeo's banishment there from Verona. Rowe wrote little about Mantua, but I thought the magnificent Palazzo Te was on the bard's trail. It was designed and decorated as a summer residence, in addition to the Palazzo Ducale, for Guglielmo Gonzaga's father, Federico, by Giulio Romano, the only artist the bard mentions by name. In The Winter's Tale, the anonymous third gentleman describes the dead Queen Hermione's statue as newly performed by that rare Italian master Giulio Romano, who, had he himself eternity and could put breath into his work, would beguile nature of her custom. Okay, who's Giulio Romano? Rich asked. Raffaello's best apprentice, heir to his studio and paintings in Rome, including Raffaello's portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. Oxford was such a fan of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier that he financed a Latin translation in 1572. Romano also sculpted tombs for a few important Mantuan citizens, among them Pietro Strozzi and Castiglione, whose mother was a Gonzaga. Oxford's Italian travels and his admiration of Castiglione were well known in England. Most travelers returning from Mantua praise Romano's frescoes and architecture. Praising his rare tombs instead means the bard was bragging. In the play's most dramatic moment, the bard upstages Romano by achieving what he says Romano could not. He puts actual breath into his work through an actress, as Hermione's painted funerary statue comes to life and speaks his line. Romano decorated the sunny rooms in Palazzo Te with startling frescoes, mostly based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, tales familiar to Oxford and the bard. The most startling cover walls, floor, and ceiling in the dim room of the giants. In Ovid's tale, the rebellious giants heaped up hills to reign as gods, but Romano's version reflects Canto 31 of Dante's Inferno, a fog-soaked cyclorama of destruction resulting from the giant's rage encircles the vortex pattern on the floor, spiraling down to the ninth circle of hell. Rounded corners enhance the illusion of a roof ripped off to reveal Jove menacing from the heavens. Like Dante and Virgil, we stand outside the circular walls, amazed at the scene like this from King John. This tempest startles mine eyes and makes me more amazed than had I seen the vaulty top of heaven figured quite o'er with burning meteors. Commend these waters to those that never saw the giant world enraged. The bard read or experienced some version of the Giants' Rebellion, much more violent and memorable than Ovid's Pile of Hills. Dante's Inferno was not translated into English until 1782. Ovid's Metamorphoses was also the undisputed source for the hilarious production of the tragic Pyramus and Thisbe, performed for Duke Theseus, Duchess Hippolyta, and the Athenian lords and ladies after they wedded the temple, but before the Bergamasque, a rustic dance from Bergamo. We are in Athens with Athenians in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or so the bard tells us, 34 times, often repeatedly in a single line, and with references to Apollo, Daphne, Cadmus, Crete, Sparta, and Thessaly. But what about the references to Roman mythology? Venus, Cupid, Neptune, Hercules, Aurora, Jove, and the Latin phrases. And what about the Duke, the Duchess, nuns, cloisters, knights, coats of arms, heraldry, San Valentino, and that dance from Bergamo? Sounds more like Italy. Where are we in this play? 25 miles southwest of Mantua lies Sabagnetta, in Oxford's time, a medieval walled town, the Guglielmo's distant cousin, Duke Vespasiano Gonzaga Colonna, reconstructed into his ideal city. Rowe proposed Sabagnetta as the setting for Midsummer, claiming the city was known as Little Athens. I told Rich I had no idea whether Rowe was right. 18th century scholars spread the city's name Little Athens of the Po. Today, you can find Little Athens on the Sabagnetta soccer team logo. But what proves that Sabagnetta was associated with Athens in 1575, or that Midsummer was set there? Sabagnetta's only gate in its impressive medieval walls bears a plaque honoring its duke. But at the oak part of Rowe's description of that gate as the Duke's Oak where the players meet, I could find no clue. Rich was clearly not impressed with it, or my explanation that the play's fairy world reflected the English court, with Titania as Queen Elizabeth doting on the Duc d'Alençon as bottom in ass's ears. During our visit, evidence supporting Rowe's naming this octagonal church of the coronation as the temple where the couples read also eluded me. Later, I found blogs in which Sabagnetta residents call this church Il Tempio del Il Coronato. So Tempio may mean chiesa or church in the local dialect. The town's roots are Roman. Just before we left, I wandered towards the center column in the large piazza, and there she was. Rowe had not mentioned the full-size statue on top of that column. Although moved to the piazza in 1584, Athena had been the patron goddess of her little Athens since 1527, when Vespasiano's father brought her back from the sack of Rome. Perhaps little Athens in Italy, with its thick brick walls, statue of Athena, and temple, provided theatrical camouflage for the queen's flirtation, sufficient to pretend it was all a dream. What author could survive putting his queen on stage, stroking the buffoonish Hercule Francois, the Duke of Alençon, in ass's ears, who boasts he could play Hercule and addresses her attendants as Monsieur? Well, maybe Oberon, King of the Fairies, could, but certainly not Will of Stratford. In Renaissance Italy, avenging spilt blood was a familial duty. Authorities banished offenders regularly and seized their goods. Today, in Verona, Juliet's house draws droves of paying foreigners visitors daily. An entryway festooned in lovers' graffiti, a trinketeria, a pasted-on Juliet balcony, although there's no balcony in the play. Italians say that, like some other famous historic houses, it's a fake. The house marked as Romeo's is closed to tourists. What caught Rich's attention was the graveyard of the Della Scala family. There, he told me about the Della Scalas who ruled Verona in the 14th century, when the Veronese say the immortalized lovers died. I mentioned the family members are called Gliscaligeri in Italian. Aeschylus is Prince of Verona in the play, as well as a character and the first word in Measure for Measure. One of Oxford's lesser titles was Lord of Aeschylus. Sounds like the bard used Oxford's name in these two plays. 10 miles southwest is Verona's Villafranca, identified by Rowe as the Freetown in Prince Aeschylus's speech. Montague, come you this afternoon to know our farther pleasure in this case, to old Freetown, our common judgment place. A fortified giant capable of holding multiple other castles within its walls, and now a public festival park, Old Freetown was constructed in the 12th century by the Scaligeri, so old by the 14th. To intimidate a subject and lay down the law, handing him to Villafranca would do it. This is important because it is different than the earlier versions of Romeo and Juliet's story. The English version, a poem published in 1562, before Will of Stratford was born, called The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet, is the undisputed source for the bard. Scholars debate whether its author, A.R.B.R., identified at some point as an Arthur Brooke, translated it from French or Italian. Brooke says he saw it set forth on the stage. Master Brooke's biography is sparse, and Arthur Brooke was admitted to the Inner Temple, and Arthur Brooke died by drowning in 1563. Romeus and Juliet was not a great poem. Preachy, over-emotional, over-detailed, well, except if you were, say, 12 years old, and in Brooke's words, commanded to write it by she whose hest I must obey. Wow, only one she that could be. Brooke tells us the poem is his first and youthful work, with more to follow when time gives strength. Brooke's apprehension writing the 3,020-line poem on royal command is evident in the first excerpt on your screen, which reads a lot like the second excerpt from another poem, The Loss of My Good Name, written by E.O., Edward Oxenford, sometime before 1576, most likely in 1563, when he was 13, and his half-sister sued to have him declared a bastard. Why the similarity between the poems? Maybe Oxford knew Brooke's work and copied a section stylistically, or maybe Oxford wrote both poems, penning Romeus and Juliet at age 12 under a pseudonym, as noble authors customarily did. Due to his father's death, 1562 was the year Oxford became the Queen's ward by law, subject to obey her command and hest. Brooke, unaware of its size, called Freetown Verona the Capulets' country house. The bard fully adopted Brooke's tales and characters, and yet somehow knew to correct that mistake and properly identified it as the Scaligeri intimidation and judicial center. Like Petruchio and Caterina, Rich and I resumed our authorship debate on the road to Padua. Oxford took the Brenta Canal. In November 1575, he wrote to William Cecil from Padua, and he orated there, an indication his Latin and Italian were excellent, considering the renowned University of Padua. Rowe tried to locate the Taming of the Shrew's first Padua scene using geographic clues from the play. Chiesa San Luca, the parish church where Kate and Petruchio marry, a nearby canal, a bridge and inn. But what most modern audiences experience is really the play within the play. Without common textual cuts, Taming opens in England, not in Padua. An English lord resembling Oxford with his troupe of actors tricks Christopher Sly, a drunk tinker, into believing he is the lord watching the play set in Padua. Sly comments on the Italian action occasionally. In the play's similar and anonymous precursor called The Taming of a Shrew, the confused tinker asks, "Am I not Don Cristo Vere? Besides Oxford's name slipped in again for laughs, the Bard's Taming contains an Italian geography lesson. People and goods hail from Padua, Mantua, Verona, Florence, Naples, Pisa, Venice, Bergamo, and Rheims. Sounds like our Bard is boasting of his knowledge of Italy again. But why Rheims? Rheims is in France. Other English nobles traveled to Paris and Italy, but only Oxford had the honor of attending King Henri's coronation and wedding at Rheims before traveling to the Italian cities listed in Taming. Circumstantial evidence? Sure, but you have to admit it's piling up. In Belmont is a lady richly left, and she's fair. So Bassanio describes Portia to his kinsman, the merchant of Venice. Portia lives in an idyllic palazzo in Belmont. Stratfordians claim Belmont is a fictional place. It was a fictional Adriatic port. In the 1588 source for the play, called Il Pecorone by Giovanni Fiorentino. But Rowe and others, using 3 geographic clues in the Bard's version, pin it on the banks of the brown, wide Brenta Canal, 10 miles west of Venice, as Villa Foscari Malcontenta. In the Bard's Belmont, Portia's waiting woman, Nerissa, asks her, "Do you not remember a Venetian that came hither in the company of the Marquis of Montferrat?" In July 1574, the Foscari family used Villa Malcontenta, designed by Andrea Palladio, to entertain Oxford's new acquaintances, King Henri of France and Guglielmo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua and Marquis of Montferrat. Henri's introducing Oxford to Guglielmo likely procured Oxford his invitations to the Palazzo Te and Savignetta, and from the Foscari to Villa Malcontenta. What other Englishman could boast of such connections? In Merchant, by using Guglielmo's lesser title of Marquis, the bard demonstrates his insider knowledge. Guglielmo was elevated from Marquis to Duke of Montferrat in 1574, the year he and Henri visited Villa Malcontenta. In May, Oxford settled into the richest and most splendid city in Europe until the plague arrived and he left to tour the peninsula, returning in September. Il Pecorone was not translated into English until 1632, after both Oxford and Will of Stratford were dead. It contains The Lady at Belmont, 3 caskets, the Venetian merchant financing a lovesick relative, the Jewish lender, the pound of flesh, the lady disguised as a lawyer, and the missing ring, all also in the bard's version. To Il Pecorone, which he could only have read in Italian, what does the bard add that only someone very familiar with Venice would know? Plenty, but this is what impressed Rich. Spending and borrowing prodigiously, as his letters indicate, Oxford likely knew the Rialto Campo, the Venetian banking center mentioned 5 times in the bard's play, and not at all in Il Pecorone. Rowe names his 1541 statue located there called Il Gobbo, the Hunchback, as the source for Shylock's servant's name based on the Riverside Shakespeare and other modern additions, calling him Lancelot Gobbo, and his father, who carries a basket on his back, Old Gobbo. While Old Gobbo's name may have come from the statue, the sons did not. Lancelot Gobbo is a modern editorial change from the first folio's Lancelet Giobbe. Giobbe in Italian means Job, from the Bible's book of Job, not a hunchback, but the Gentile prophet, whom the devil robbed of family and wealth, exactly Shylock's fate. To understand Giobbe, when he says he serves the devil, or the fiend is at my elbow, we need to know Italian, like the bard, and know that the church of San Giobbe is located near the Jewish ghetto. Protection of Venice's wealth depended on its warships, which could be constructed in the arsenale in one day from prefabricated parts. Venetians regarded their arsenale as top secret and posted guards on its 2 miles of ramparts. In Merchant, the bard displays impressive knowledge about Venetian merchant ships, foreign ships, trade routes, hazards, and in Othello about warships. The Venetians surrendered Cyprus to the Turks in 1570 after 11 months of siege. The Turks slaughtered every inhabitant. In retaliation, the Holy League annihilated the Turkish armada at Lepanto, a victory memorialized in the Doge's palace. No English translation of Othello's source, an Italian novella by Giovanni Giraldi, existed in Will of Stratford's lifetime. In the bard's version, instead of surrender, under Othello's command, the island is saved, in part by a storm that destroys the Spanish Armada. Yes, I said the Spanish Armada. The bard uses foreign locations to tell contemporary English history. In Othello, the bard reveals knowledge of sea battles. Oxford personally fought the Armada at sea, which is the battle and the victory described in Othello. The bard singles out one warship. The third gentleman, in the first folio's Othello, describes the damage that noble ship caused the enemy. And then the ship is here put in, a V-E-R-E, Veronessa. Starting in the early 1700s, Stratfordian editors have struggled with the word Veronessa, substituting Veronesso, Veronessa, and Veronesa. Isn't it obvious why the bard chose Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford's name, to describe this ship? On our last evening in Venice, I asked Rich, have I convinced you that Oxford wrote the Shakespeare canon? I don't have enough information, he responded. But there is no way Willis Stratford wrote it. No one could have that level of detail about that many places in Italy unless he had been here himself. So I won the battle, and I had a plan to win the entire war with a trip to Sicily. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Dorothea, for your wonderful talk on your trip to Italy and your attempt to convince your lawyer husband regarding the authorship. Many people commented in the Q&A section that your photographs were beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing them with us. And next, our video is the second place winner from the 2020 contest, Interview with the Stratfordian, The Works, by Jonathan David Dixon.
Thank you, Professor, for joining me for my video for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship video contest. Oxfordians are jerks. They're like Holocaust deniers. Well, on the subject of Oxfordians, what do you make of all the parallels between incidents in the life of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and the works of Shakespeare? Yes, I always tell my students, don't fall into the trap of supposing the works are autobiographical. That is an illusion. Shakespeare always kept himself well disguised. The man isn't visible. He didn't insert his own opinions or comment on the topical controversies of the day. Say, what do you think about the recent research into the illegal grain hoarding that Shakespeare of Stratford did during a time of famine? It has given new force to the old arguments about the contemporaneity of the grain hoarding scenes in Coriolanus. Well, do you think then that all the parallels between the character of Polonius in Hamlet and the real-life Lord Burleigh might display contemporaneity too? Burleigh was Oxford's father-in-law. Don't be drawn into the trap of assuming the works are autobiographical. But you just said about the Oxfordians are conspiracy theorists. They approach Hamlet via fantastically cryptic supposed parallels between Lord Burleigh and the character of Polonius. Weren't traditional scholars pointing out those parallels 50 years before there even were Oxfordians? Well, plain old intuition inclines me to the view that the dramatist who anglicized the name of the historical M.L.I.S, Prince of Denmark, was a certain Stratfordian who named his son after his friend Hamlet Sadler. Well, actually, Shakespeare's son and friend were named Hamnet, not Hamlet. But so now it is permissible to look for autobiographical elements in Shakespeare's works. So what do you think then about the fact that in that same play, Hamlet is captured by pirates who recognize him and release him when they realize who he is, and they leave him stripped naked on the beach, and that exact same thing happened to Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford? Don't be drawn into the trap of assuming the works are autobiographical. By the way, what do you think about the use of the phrase hate away in the sonnet 145? It's a pun on the name of Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. It would make sense for this sonnet to be about her because she was the rock on which he relied throughout his life. So now the works are autobiographical. So as long as we're on elements in the sonnets, what do you think about the fact that Shakespeare repeatedly refers to himself as old, lame, poor, and in disgrace, when none of those things apply to Shakespeare of Stratford, but they all apply to Edward de Vere? Don't be drawn into the trap of supposing the works are autobiographical. Shakespeare kept himself well disguised. The man was invisible. Oxfordians are jerks. They're dogmatic and abusive. Doubting Shakespeare's authorship is a form of mental illness.
We're going to go now to a quick panel. I'm going to invite Roger and Kevin back to talk about manuscript circulation and the Band of Brothers. Thanks for joining me. I completed my documentary film with Oxford's return to London. He came back from Italy, and his poems were just being published in the Paradise of Dainty Devices. There were 2 new theaters being constructed, the Theatre and the Curtain. And during the next 10 to 15 years, Oxford led a group of writers. He had a literary circle described in recent talks by Kevin Gilvary and Alexander Waugh. This is the period of Oxford's life that I'm most interested in researching now, when he lived at Fisher's Folly, where today you can see the Tesco Metro, and again, had around him a group of writers who Alexander Waugh gave us a beautiful graphic image of, where he is the center of this world of writers in London. So I'd like to start by asking Roger a question about the poetry. Stephen May is an author who's written extensively about Elizabethan Renaissance poetry and the circulation of manuscripts, and he is one of the people who identified Oxford as the author of My Mind to Me, A Kingdom Is. And
Right.
I was wondering...
He was the first one to do that.
Yes.
He did it, yeah.
Exactly. So he is the person who correctly attributed it. And so I was wondering, Roger, in your research into the volumes of the poetry that you've published so far, what did you learn about the relationship between the circulation of manuscripts and attribution?
Wow, that's a really good question, and I probably should have prepared for it better. Most of the poems that are involved in the series of books on Oxford's poems that I'm working with, most of them are from published sources. I think the only ones that are not are some of the ones that Stephen May had transcribed that have Oxford's name on them. Just to clarify the history for everybody, Loney, as early as 1921, said, not only did Oxford write about 20 or so poems or 30 poems, I think his list was a little longer, that under his own name, but he also wrote a bunch of other lyric poems that are not well attributed from the period. And so I've been sort of trying to investigate and test that proposition and let people know what those poems are.
Right. One of my questions related to that was that, you noted in the first volume 1 of Oxford's poetry that we have poems signed E.O., but we have another collection of poems that were attributed, again, to his contemporaries or written under a pseudonym. And my question is, does the use of pseudonyms such as Ignoto imply that the circulation of the poems was so widespread that a conscious decision was made to stop taking credit for the work at some point, as we might infer from the appearance of the name Shakespeare on the long poems?
Well, I would highly recommend, on the subject of pseudonyms, I highly recommend Alex McNeil's article. I don't have, it's on for the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who wrote under at least 70 different names, which he didn't call pseudonyms, he called them heteronyms. And for him, and I believe this is probably true for De Vere too, the invention of the pseudonym was the first creative act. And then so you actually have, that's why he called them, Pessoa called them heteronyms. They're really sort of like beings that coexist in the artist and have their own set of artistic interests. And I think that it's very clear, not only from Pessoa, but from a number of other cases, that writers that are really into pseudonyms often use multiple pseudonyms. It is not unusual at all for that to happen. And I believe that De Vere did that as well. Although admittedly, that opens lots of questions that, have to be really debated and discussed a lot.
Sure. Thank you. And I wanted to turn to Kevin now and ask about what you've learned, what you've discovered about Oxford's involvement in the creation of the theater when he returned from Italy, particularly the curtain. If you could just give us a few of the most significant findings from your recent talk on that topic, since we are short on time. Thank you, Kevin.
Well, in 1576, the theatre was opened, and the traditional story is that it was just Burbage and his men who got it together so as to have a public theatre. And then the curtain opened in the same precinct about a year later. I think this is all thrown into question by the discovery a few years ago of a manuscript in French of a travel writer who described London. And he said that these two marvelous theatres, one of them was built by a great lord. Now, I think the great lord would have to be the Earl of Leicester. And certainly the theatre had far more prestige than that. And I think that he was using that as a base to prepare his players to prepare for their performance at court. And I think that the whole of the theatrical scene was intended for court performance, and then the spin-offs were going back to the theatre, performing either in preparation or afterwards for the public. As to the second one, well, it would have to be another great lord, somebody who had the money to put up for it. The only other person I could think of is Ambrose Dudley. So that was Robert Dudley's brother, the Earl of Warwick. And I think that's unlikely. And then we know that the Earl of Oxford took over Warwick's men a couple of years later. So my hypothesis, just to be very careful about it, is that Oxford set up the curtain in quite a different way. It had a very wide stage suitable for fencing jousts as well. So I believe he used that as a base for his players to prepare for their court performances.
Wonderful, thank you. And we know also that he was first working at the Savoy Hospital in the 1570s and then at Fisher's Folly in 1518. So it's generally accepted that Monday and Lily were serving as his secretaries, but what exactly does that mean? As accomplished writers in their own right, what was their role with Oxford? Were they, I think they were not simply scribes, but perhaps editors. We know that he worked with several translators. Can you just talk a little bit about what we do know about his...
Well, I think you're right. They're not simply what we would call a secretary, but they are sort of executives, chief executive officers. So I think that they are people who are controlling other writers. I think these other writers being encouraged to write in their own way. They're certainly not writing according to a prescribed formula. And I think it's the range of literature that's emerging from there that's most impressive. And I think that these two, especially, and Oxford as well, are working together to help improve the English language, to improve literature in English. And so first of all, in the Savoy, which he was renting, and then secondly, Fisher's Folly, which is closer to the theatre, from about 1580, which coincides with when he took over Warwick's men. So I think that he just had that geographical shift. But certainly Monday and Lily were very, very important people in terms of what they themselves were doing and how they're directing others.
Right. Did you want to comment on that, Roger?
Yeah, I just want to confirm that those two names, Churchyard is also really important, but Monday and Lily are really, he did lots of different interesting things with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of my questions was about the overlap between the school of what's known as the School of Night, the writers known as the University Wits, and Oxford Circle. The idea that scholars flocked to Oxford and worked under his direction, particularly some of the poorer writers, that he was their patron. Any comments on that concept of what was going on there? That's what I'm most interested in researching, as I said. So, for example,
well, yeah, well, there's a group of people around Raleigh who were, some of them were poets and literary writers, but they were wider than that. They were alchemists and they were mathematicians, and it's sort of, the School of Night has sort of gone out of fashion recently, but it's not completely out. And there's certainly references to groups of writers there, which included Marlowe. I think possibly Marlowe transferred, I think he left the Oxford stable and that he went over to the other side, as it were. I think it's a loose conglomeration. I don't think there's sort of anything particularly prescriptive about it. I think that if they were there, they were getting their board and lodging, their help with scriveners, people writing things out for them. Certainly a library and maybe translations as well. And a reading circle. They could say, here you are, Squire, what do you think of this one? I've got my new poem, my new play, whatever. And they would be able to comment on it. So I think that was working at a lower level. And then I think that there was a super level, and this is one that Stephanie Hopkins Hughes has gone in for, this elite group of writers, which included...
Oh, we've lost Kevin. He's frozen for a minute there. Well, I want to follow up on that, though, because we only have a minute left. I think that is really interesting to me, the idea that it's not a fixed group necessarily. And I have one other question for you, Roger, and that's about...
Oxford, Marlowe, Bacon...
Kevin, we could hear you, but we lost you. But I'm going to ask Roger to comment. Yes.
I want to say one other thing before you ask me. Just when we're writing about Oxford as a patron, let's remember that this is a man who wrote the word alms several times in his Bible and has underlined all of the most radical sentiments in both the Old and the New Testament about the responsibilities of wealth. So I think that's a part of the story of his early patronage before he went him and like, you know, went up, you know, and didn't
Broke,
have anything
right.
left. He went broke. Yeah. So
But yeah, the idea that they were actually workshopping the manuscripts, that's what I'm looking for. I'm very grateful to the SOF for giving me a research grant to look into the circulation of manuscripts by Oxford and his contemporaries. So I'm really excited about that. And we're going to talk about your book next, Roger, but in your work on the early allusions to Oxford as Shakespeare, did you find anything that might suggest
Can I just make
Yes,
one
go ahead,
more
Kevin.
point?
Of course.
Oh, sorry to interrupt the flow. First of all, I'm very impressed if Roger.
we're still losing
I'm
him.
sorry, Kevin, we're still not able to hear you. But Roger, my question was just about, M.L.I.S mentions the the passing of the sugared sonnets, but do you think that we might find any other evidence to suggest that either Oxford's poems or later his plays were being circulated?
Well, manuscript culture was a very, very important part of the court and a very important part of the literary scene that is somewhat invisible to us. There was lots of stuff being passed around for which there is no or very little record of it having been passed.
Right.
I think it's going to be challenging to find new evidence on this, but I think it's it needs to be done. The work needs to be done, and you're going to learn a tremendous amount about it, even if you don't find the smoking gun, right?
Thanks so much. Let's see if Kevin is able to make his last comment.
Sorry,
We can hear you, Kevin, if you'd like to make a comment before we go to the next panel.
Well, first of all, it's great that Roger's looking through these old miscellanies and seeing and trying to find if there are misattributed poems. And then secondly, there's a wonderful new resource, which I've only just discovered, called the Catalogue of English Literary Manuscripts, CELM. And the amazing number of copies of Oxford poems, which are handwritten in the 50s, 80s. I've gone through it thoroughly yet, but they are certainly turning up in handwritten material at the time. So I think that a lot of manuscripts there that are probably worth investigating. So I've only just discovered it, I'm afraid. So I'm letting other people in on the secret.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really exciting. Thank you both for taking the time to talk with me, as I said, about my next project. I really appreciate your expertise. I'm going to turn it over to Earl now for the publications panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you all for your commentaries. And I think what I really want to do is give our speakers an opportunity to give their talks on the book publishing projects they're involved with. And while we still have Kevin available, I'm going to ask him to lead off. One of the things that the De Vere Society produced a decade ago is an edition of Great Oxford, edited by Richard Mallam. And the good news is I understand this is going to be reissued by the De Vere Society.
Oh, good.
And Kevin will have more to say about this, I think, in the next few minutes here. So Kevin, take it away.
Yeah, here we are. Great Oxford. Sorry, I'm not sure who I'm showing it to. Yeah, they came out as a collection of essays. I thought they're very interesting, and I'll keep going back to them. And the De Vere Society is now in a position to republish this. We decided, we had a meeting the other day, and with Alexander, we were thinking that we probably need to just put in a few riders, either to alert people to further research since these papers were originally published, or things which have been established as erroneous. So I think we're going to make sure that when it comes out, I think the papers will be the same, but they will have these additional notes in them. Secondly, Eddie Jolly's been putting together Great Oxford 2, and this is a collection of papers which deal with basically the case for Oxford. So it's the case against the Stratford man and the case for Oxford. And these are all essays that have appeared in the De Vere Society newsletter over the last few years or so. I think that's almost ready now, and I understand that she's almost finished the indexing, and they've been looking at the proofs. And then there's going to be a third one, which I've been editing, and that's ready to go to be set. And so that will be following on soon afterwards. And this deals more generally with Oxford's life. And for me, editing it has been absolutely fantastic, because I started reading these originally and I sort of put them to one side, but now looking at them again in detail, I've found how much exciting stuff really has been done, and then making this available. And I think all three will be available as a presentation set, certainly within the next few months. The Great Oxford 1, 2, and 3.
Excellent, Kevin. Thank you so much. I highly recommend that people consider joining the DeVere Society next weekend. The DeVere Society will have their membership meeting. You still have time to sign up for that. And it will feature a film by Oxfordian Robin Phillips, apparently. So look forward to being part of that. So thank you again, Kevin, and good luck and fare forward with all your publication projects. Next, I want to ask Roger Stripman, who's obviously very involved in publications. I'm just going to hold up two of the first editions of the Brief Chronicle series, the Shakespeare Authorship Source Book, which is a wonderful collection of essays and commentaries on the whole authorship question, and then the Poems of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, the Shakespeare Question, which is volume 1 of a series he's publishing and preparing for publication under the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, under the imprimatur of Brief Chronicles. So Roger, tell us more about your plans.
Well, there's going to be 5 volumes in the poems set. Originally, there was going to be 1, and then there was going to be 2. And then the second one got so big, and I looked at it and said it needs more focused treatment. So there's going to be a series of 5. And I should say that both that first volume and the reference book, the source book, are the copies that you have of those are both about to be replaced in the next few weeks with the more current editions that do have some corrections and whatnot, and will hopefully have a little bit sharper design. And we needed to standardize the design for the rest of the series, which was not in place at the time those were issued. So the plan is to do, aside from the poems, is to do 1 volume a year focused on a particular topic. The next one up would be Shakespeare and the Law. And then I hope to do a volume on Shakespeare and cryptography, and 1 on Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. And those are the ones that probably are going to come soonest, and we have plans stretching out further than that, but those are pretty far in the future at this point. So that's the basic plan. The idea is to provide materials that answer or address really focused questions. The Stratfordians, like to have silver bullet methodologies. They like to slay you with 1 bullet, and I think this series would be designed to kind of provide tools for answering each one of those allegedly, unsurmountable challenges.
One other comment, Roger. I know you and Alexander Waugh have been working on the Shakespeare Allusions books for a number of years now, and we're all excited about the possibilities that will represent in terms of research.
Right.
What do you see as the possibility of getting that into print in the coming year?
Well, I hope so. Alexander himself is more directly connected with the production at this point. The first volume has been typeset and proofread, and the second volume that is still happening on. And at that point in time, we will issue some copies, and we will hopefully be in negotiation with the publisher at that point to actually publish it. That's the plan.
Outstanding, friends. Well, you're hearing things that are coming hot off the press, really, and among the foremost Shakespeare authorship scholars in the world today. So I thank you, Roger, for your contributions and for your ongoing work. I can't imagine how you can teach full time and still produce all this amazing material, but we're in awe and honored to have you part of our program here for so many years and been so productive. Finally, I want to invite Jim Warren back onto the panel here to comment a little bit more about his forthcoming work. You've heard a bit about it earlier today. And Jim, why don't you just take it away and help fill us in on what we can expect forthcoming.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. Well, I have a dozen or so projects underway. I just want to tell you about a few of them. One is the book that I showed you earlier, looking at how John Thomas Looney's Oxfordian theory has affected understanding of Shakespeare over the last 100 years. It's hopefully going to come out by the end of May. It's in proof, and it's being edited and proofread, and so it's very close to coming out. This index to Oxfordian publications, the 4th edition was in 2017, almost 4 years ago. I have thousands of new entries that I've discovered in my work on the first 25 years of the Oxfordian movement, which will go into here. It's already quite thick, but it's going to be even thicker in the next issue. I hope to get the new edition out in August or so. Another project is a collection of 450 letters that Oxfordians sent to each other in the first 25 years of the Oxfordian movement. I have the full text of the letters. Wow. Here's what it looks like. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, so they're going to be annotated and introduced to explain the significance of the content of the letters. But it's very exciting for me, and maybe for everybody, to see what the most important Oxfordian scholars from 1920 to 1945 or so said to each other as they commented on their own work, their own findings, on the developments within the Oxfordian movement, how Stratfordians were responding to their work. It's all here in their own words that they shared with each other. It's a fascinating look. So that's another project. I'm going to do a modern English edition of Cardenas Comfort, known as Hamlet's book. It's unbelievable that there is no modern English edition of this book. It's called Hamlet's book because so many of the themes in it are reflected in Hamlet. The only edition out there is this Da Capo Press edition, which is actually a facsimile of the 1573 or 76 edition. I want to show you what it looks like. It is in the old style. It's almost illegible. It's it's just unreadable. So there's no easy way to read this book until my modern English edition comes out. It's a hell of a lot of work to go through that and put it into modern English. But I'm going to do that, and I've been working on it off and on for a couple of years or 3 years. Other projects underway. I have created a Microsoft Word version of Dorothy Ogburn's final book. It's called Elizabeth and Shakespeare, England's Power and Glory. It's like 600, 700 pages long, never been published. It exists only in 2 copies in a manuscript, typed manuscript. One is at in the Ogburn archives at Emory University, which I haven't been able to see because, the library is closed because of the virus. But from Michael Delahoyd, I got a copy of the other, even poorer quality copy, typewritten copy, and have gone through it and created a Word document, which I'm now editing, and then I'll annotate. And if I can get the rights, I will publish that. In the background is the biography of John Thomas Looney, which I'll be drawing in large part on the papers I got from Looney's grandson, almost 2 years ago. But I spent a lot of time inventorying those papers and scanning them all in so that copies exist. And with John Rubin, we're talking to a major university about housing those papers so that they'll be protected and available for scholars to look at. But again, the COVID situation has delayed that a little bit. But the other big
secret to your productivity? What is the secret to your productivity, Jim?
Yeah, and what's worse is that I've lost access to the academic databases because I'm in Thailand, and Thailand doesn't really have secure protection for computer things. And so the databases based in the US have cut off access from Thailand.
Oh, wow.
And, so has PayPal, so I've lost access to a lot of things because of security concerns in Thailand. Anyways, the other big project that I'm just about to start, I've been working on it a little bit, but I'm going to, once this book is out the door, then I'm going to go into searching for and finding the archives or papers of the first generations of Oxfordians. Percy Allen, Colonel Ward, Captain Ward, Ava Turner Clark, Admiral Holland, Colonel Douglas, Professor Louis Benezet. Their papers must surely total, in some cases, tens of thousands of pages of their own writings and drafts and their correspondence. And yet nobody has found them, or maybe no one has even looked for these things, but I'm going to find them if they're still in existence. And if they're not in existence, I'm going to find out what happened to them, when and where they were destroyed. Then there's also the archives of people that early Oxfordians, including Looney, communicated or corresponded with. I know he corresponded with Sir Sidney Lee. I don't know where Sir Sidney Lee's papers are. I haven't been able to find them, but they must exist somewhere. And if they do, Looney's letters to Lee are probably there. I know that Looney wrote at least 6 and maybe many more letters to Sir George Greenwood. I don't know where Greenwood's papers are. And there are many other scholars that I have their letters to Looney. They were in the papers I got from Looney's grandson. I need to find Looney's letters to them. And then on non-Oxfordian stuff, Looney was in frequent communication with one of his students during World War I. One of his students, I have more than 20 letters, in some cases just postcards, and they're all marked, passed by censor, that his students sent to him during the war from the front lines in World War I. So I have those letters to Looney. So Looney, and they indicate that Looney wrote to him as often as he wrote to Looney. So I've investigated a bit and found out that soldier survived the war. He didn't die in the war. He survived until 1962. So it could be that 20 of Looney's letters to him are with his descendants. So I'm going to track down the family members and find out if those 20 letters, are still in existence, to give me further insights into Looney the man, apart from his Oxfordian activities. And also, Looney's, it's widely known that his positivist activities were so important to him that they influenced, his thinking and his dedication to the pursuit of truth. His positivist letters were so important to him, his communications with the leaders, the national leaders of the positivist movement, that when he sent more than 60 letters to them, he kept carbon copies in a notebook. So I have that notebook with those carbon copies of those letters. I'm halfway through transcribing them all, and they give fascinating insights into his discussions with these national leaders in that movement. And this was in the decade just before he turned to the Oxfordian investigations. So, we'll have real insights into him as a man and his philosophical interests apart from his Oxfordian work, and all that will come out in the biography at some point in the next decade.
Oh my goodness, Jim, you are a phenomenon. We have found our hero, and congratulations, sir, on all this stuff that you're.
Well, Earl, as you know, once you're retired and you have a pension, you don't have to work for a living. Then your time is your own, and you can put it into whatever you think is of interest and value. And for me, that's the Oxfordian movement and the Oxfordian claim and investigating that. So I'm doing it as a labor of love because it's something I love to do, and I think it has some value for the world.
Well, yours is a love supreme, Jim. Yours is truly a love supreme. So. Now, thank you, Roger and Jim and Kevin, for your contributions. You've all received your homework assignments now, and we'll be checking back with you in the fall on whether you've completed them or not. So I'd like to turn the program back over for a few more sessions with Cheryl, some video, and then some concluding comments. We're coming down to the close of the sessions. Thank you so much for participating.
Thanks, Earl. I wanted to thank Jim and Kevin again. And Roger, I wanted to let you know that I've been admonished for not allowing you to finish your presentation. Everyone's so excited to see the rest of your presentation, and they're wondering if you will present it again, perhaps at the fall symposium. So we're really looking forward to seeing the rest of your presentation, and I apologize that we ran short on time.
Thank you. I think you had to do that. So.
Well, we are fascinated by the work that you've done, so thank you. Our next and final video today is the first place winner from the 2020 video contest. It's called The Earl of Oxford's March, remixed by Greg Buse. And it's exactly the type of entertaining short film that Tom Renier imagined when he conceived the program. So congratulations to Greg again. Here's The Earl of Oxford's March, remixed.
Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Edward de Vere. You might know me better by the pen name Shakespeare. My people are the oldest British nobles in the mix. We came with Will.I.am the Conqueror in 1066. I was maxing and relaxing outside Castle Hedingham when a couple of things went down with my fam. So I was raised in William Cecil's house. That guy was stiff as wood. Satirized him as Polonius as only I could. Big librarian, a daughter named Anne, and he was pretty much Elizabeth's Game of Thrones hand. I was married to his daughter, Anne. It was kind of rough and rocky, and before too long I ran to travel Italy and France, knew the languages of courses. That's how I read the untranslated works that were my sources. I was in Venice, saw a painting of Adonis, and just like in the poem I wrote, he wore a little bonnet. On my way back home like Hamlet, set up on by pirates, left me naked on the beach like him. This isn't rocket science. At Gad's Hill, my mates and I robbed the Queen's receivers, just like in Henry IV Part 1, and you're still non-believers. The bed trick has now become theatrical cliche. Well, it was pulled on me and it's in 4 of my plays. £1,000 annuity from QE1. That's like $1 million a year today. That's right, son. Didn't have to account for what I did with the money. So let me fill you in, cause it may seem kind of funny. At Fisher's Folly gathered university wits. Mentored Lily, Monday, Nash and Green, a playwriting blitz. Led a literary movement, brought the Renaissance to Britain. Revitalized the language with the plays that I had written. Taught Brits about their history, bolstered national pride. At a time with Queen and country under threat from all sides. Wrote the plays and poems and sonnets, didn't even get beheaded. Named be buried where my body is, cause I don't need no credit. Nothing is truer than truth, which is...
Why's he always got to drag us into it? I don't know, but it's hurtful.
It really is.
Hello, everyone. For our last presentation today, we're very pleased to announce the presentation of the first Tom Renier Veritas Award. To confer the award, Julie Bianchi, SOF Vice President and Chair of the Video Contest Committee, is going to say a few words in a previously recorded video. Thanks, Julie.
Hi, everybody. I think you can see why the video we just played was the winner of our 2020 contest. It's a perfect combination of fact and fun, and a fitting tribute to Tom Renier, who inspired the award we're about to bestow, because having earned the titles of both actor and lawyer, Tom was an engaging speaker who could explain the dry judicial nuances of Elizabethan law to the rest of us in the merriest of ways. Also, his relentless drive to promote the authorship question in as many forums as possible, resulted in the Imagineering of our first annual video contest. Now, polymath, as Tom Renier was, there is a specialized skill set required to launch a successful video contest in the 21st century, one that requires finesse in the ever-changing electronic world of web page construction and design. Luckily, Tom found the perfect creative partner in the Oxfordian Jennifer Newton, a longtime blogger on Oxfordian topics and host of her own podcast, The Shakespeare Underground. Jennifer has applied her talents for many years as the primary webmaster for the SOF, and she now acts as director of website design. She's our technology editor, as well as co-editor of the content for our webpage with Brian Wildenthal. Those of us who've had the pleasure of working with Jennifer are continually amazed and delighted by the flower of the skills she unfolds while interpreting the demands that the SOF board and its committees ask of her. Now, she questions us delicately and patiently before responding, always creatively and with this demonstrable expertise and thoughtful attention to our time constraints. She's a consummate collaborator, one who finds ways to give structure to our ideas to ensure that the visitor experience to the SOF webpage is both informative and beautiful. It's therefore my honor, my great pleasure, to name on behalf of the SOF the recipient of the first Tom Renier Veritas Award, Jennifer Newton.
Congratulations, Jennifer. Yeah.
Yes, congratulations, Jennifer. Jennifer's input is invaluable. She's creative, she's visionary, she's modest, she's amusing, she's persevering. For those of us that have known her for a while, she's the master behind the curtain in so many ways. So congratulations. We love that you had this achievement. Finally, we're coming down to the last couple of minutes of our presentations. I hope you've all really enjoyed what we presented for you today through the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship sponsored symposium. We will be meeting again virtually in the fall. Regrettably, last year in 2020 and in 2021, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival will not be producing Shakespeare productions during the times that we have previously scheduled our annual conferences, which usually run for 4 days. But we have rescheduled it for September 22nd to the 25th, 2022. And we want you all to come if you can make it to Ashland. We always have an excellent time there. We've already held 3 conferences there in past years, going back to 2005. And the productions of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the collegiality of getting together after this COVID pandemic is going to be critical to all of us. So be sure you all go out and get your vaccinations so we could all enjoy each other's company in audiences in the future. We will be producing a program in the fall again, but in the meantime, I want to remind our viewers that there are programs going on over the next month, sponsored by the Vere Society, the Shakespearean Authorship Trust of the UK, and the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable of Los Angeles, who will be hearing presentations from Dennis McCarthy and Michael Blanding from the recent research he's done on Thomas North and its relationship with the works of Shakespeare. So a lot of very exciting things will be forthcoming, and we know enough about what's going to be forthcoming in terms of publications to keep your Amazon accounts active during the coming year. So look forward very much to seeing you all in the future, and thank you so much for your attendance. And I turn it over to Cheryl for the final word.
Thanks so much, Earl. As Earl said, we hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. We did have over 300 people register, and at most times over 200 people with us live in and out. So we would hope that you would also continue to engage with the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship through membership, tax-deductible donations to our nonprofit educational organization, for which you saw there are some lovely thank you gifts, and through your own reading and continued participation in this unrivaled mystery. That really is our mission, to encourage people to learn more, to do scholarly inquiry, and to do more research. We also hope that during this time together today, you've received valuable information, have been disabused of academically sanctified misinformation, and understand the value of changing opinions when considering the works of Shakespeare and the attribution. We look forward to seeing all of you in the fall when we launch another virtual program, and to greeting you personally, as Earl said, in 2022 in Ashland for our next in-person conference. Finally, I just want to thank all of our faculty presenters today for your time and commitment and research, to the conference, communications, and fundraising committees of the SOF, to the entire team here at AV Presentations, to the SOF President John Hamill and the Board of Trustees for their support of the symposium, and to all of you for taking time out of your Saturday to join us today. Thank you again. Thanks, everyone.